When night falls and the noise of the world begins to fade, certain questions quietly return. Who are we, beneath our roles and routines? What is the soul, if it exists at all? And what, ultimately, is a life meant for? Long before modern psychology or neuroscience, these questions were already being asked in ancient Greece. Two minds, standing at the foundation of Western thought, offered answers so different that their echoes still shape how we understand ourselves today. Plato and Aristotle did not simply disagree about ideas or logic. They disagreed about what it means to be human. Plato believed that the human soul was older than the body it inhabited. To him, the soul existed before birth, dwelling in a higher, purer realm where truth was complete and unchanging. Life on earth, in Plato's view, was not the beginning of our journey, but a kind of forgetting. We are born into a world of shadows, imperfect reflections of eternal forms, and we spend our lives struggling to remember what the soul once knew. From this perspective, learning is not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the act of recollection. Truth does not come from the senses, which are unreliable and easily deceived, but from turning inward, away from appearances, toward reason and contemplation. The body, for Plato, is a temporary vessel, sometimes even a prison, that distracts the soul from its higher purpose. In such a worldview, the meaning of life is not happiness in the ordinary sense. It is purification. It is the gradual freeing of the soul from illusion, desire, and attachment to the material world. Suffering, then, becomes something to endure rather than eliminate, because it reminds us that this world was never meant to be perfect. Peace lies elsewhere, beyond the visible horizon. Aristotle, who studied under Plato for many years, chose a radically different path. Where Plato looked upward and inward, Aristotle looked around. He did not deny the soul, but he rejected the idea that it could exist independently of the body. For Aristotle, the soul is not a separate substance waiting to escape. It is the organizing principle of a living being, the reason a body is alive rather than inert matter. A human soul, in this sense, is inseparable from human activity. It thinks, feels, chooses, and acts within the world, not beyond it. Knowledge does not come from remembering a forgotten realm, but from observing reality carefully, patiently, and repeatedly. Truth is discovered through experience, shaped by reason, and refined through practice. Because of this, Aristotle's understanding of life feels closer to everyday experience. The purpose of living is not to flee the world, but to live well within it. Happiness, or eudaimonia, is not a fleeting emotion, nor a reward waiting after death. It is a state of flourishing achieved through balance, moderation, and the cultivation of virtue over time. Virtue for Aristotle is not an abstract ideal, it is a habit. Courage is learned by acting courageously. Kindness is formed through repeated acts of care. Wisdom grows from judgment exercised in real situations, not from withdrawing into pure contemplation. A good life is built slowly, through choices made again and again in ordinary circumstances. Here, suffering is not a sign that the world is broken beyond repair. It is part of life's texture, something to be understood, navigated, and integrated. There is no need for a perfect world elsewhere, because meaning is already present in the imperfect one we inhabit. These two visions of the soul offer more than philosophical contrast. They offer two ways of coping with existence. The Platonic soul finds comfort in transcendence, When life feels heavy or unjust, Plato whispers that this was never the final destination, that truth lies beyond appearances, that loss and pain, though real, do not define the soul's true home. The Aristotelian soul finds grounding in presence. When life feels uncertain, Aristotle reminds us that meaning is created through action, through relationships, through finding balance rather than escape. That fulfillment does not require another world, only attention to this one. Over centuries, these visions quietly shaped entire civilizations. Religious traditions absorbed Plato's emphasis on an eternal soul and a higher realm beyond earthly life. Educational systems, ethical frameworks, and political thought leaned toward Aristotle's focus on practice, character, and lived experience. Even today, debates about happiness, purpose, and mental well-being often echo this ancient divide. Yet the power of this contrast lies not in choosing a winner. Most human lives move between these two poles. There are moments when we long for something beyond ourselves, clarity, permanence, meaning untouched by change. And there are moments when we simply want to live well where we are, to find peace in routine, balance in effort, and dignity in small actions. At night, when distractions fade, these questions become softer, less urgent, but more honest. Are we seeking escape or engagement? Are we trying to remember a lost truth or build one patiently over time? Are we living as Plato imagined or as Aristotle advised? Perhaps the enduring legacy of these two thinkers is not the answers they gave, but the space they left open between them. A quiet space where reflection can rest, where the soul, however one understands it, can slow down, breathe, and simply consider what kind of life feels most its own. And in that space, without conflict or urgency, the mind may finally find what it needs most at the end of the day. Not certainty, but calm understanding. Close your eyes now. Let the walls of your rooms dissolve into the violet haze of a Mediterranean evening. The air here is warm, still holding the heat of the day in the limestone and the dry earth, carrying the scent of wild oregano, crushed pine needles, and the distant salty tang of the Aegean Sea. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We are drifting back 24 centuries to a city that has seen too much war and is now resting in an uneasy peace. This is Athens, not the gleaming white city of our museum dreams, but the real city, messy, vibrant, and surprisingly colorful. High above on the Acropolis, the Parthenon does not shine with the stark whiteness of bare marble. That is a misunderstanding of history, a bleaching caused by time. In this moment, the great temple is alive with color, its friezes painted in rich blues, vibrant reds, and heavy gold that catches the last fire of the setting sun, making the gods carved into the stone seem to move as the shadows lengthen. Down below, in the winding streets of the Agora, the noise of the market is finally beginning to settle. The shouts of fishmongers claiming their catch is fresh from the nets of Poseidon have faded, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas hidden in the olive trees. A young man walks through these cooling streets. He is broad-shouldered and strong, with the thick chest of a wrestler, moving with a physical confidence that betrays his aristocratic lineage. His name is Aristocles, though the world will remember him by the nickname his wrestling coach gave him for his wide frame, Plato. He is not yet the bearded sage of the history books. He is young, roughly 20 years old, and his mind is a storm of poetry and politics. He wears the simple woolen chiton of a citizen, his sandals slapping softly against the dusty stones. Athens is a city that loves the sound of its own voice. Even at twilight, groups of men linger by the stores, arguing about the price of barley or the nature of justice. For in Athens, silence is treated with deep suspicion, and every citizen considers himself an expert on everything from naval warfare to vegetable gardening. But Plato is quiet tonight. He is heading toward a specific corner of the city, drawn by a voice that is unlike the smooth, polished rhetoric of the politicians. He is looking for an old man with a pug nose and bulging eyes, a stonecutter by trade who claims to know nothing, yet whose questions unravel the certainty of everyone he meets. The war with Sparta is over, the humiliating defeat still fresh, and the democracy is fragile, bruising easily like overripe fruit. In this atmosphere of twilight anxiety, young Plato seeks something solid, something true, unaware that the tragedy awaiting his teacher will soon shatter his world and force him to build a new one, not made of stone, but of ideas that will outlast the marble temples glowing on the hill above him. The twilight of that innocent evening did not last, for history rarely allows the sun to stand still, and the shadows that were gathering over Athens were not merely the cooling shade of olive trees, but the darker, colder shapes of political paranoia. It is a strange and heavy thing to watch a city turn against its own conscience, slowly, like a fever taking hold of a body that does not yet know it is sick. The trial of Socrates took place in the heat of the day, under the glare of a sun that seemed to expose every flaw in the limestone and every bead of sweat on the faces of the jurors. Imagine the noise of 501 men, a jury so large it felt more like a crowd than a court, shuffling their sandals on the dusty floor, coughing, whispering, and fanning themselves against the stifling air. They were bakers, tanners, farmers, and soldiers, ordinary men charged with deciding the fate of a man who had spent his life proving that ordinary wisdom was mostly illusion. Socrates stood before them, 70 years old, wearing the same rough cloak he wore every day, looking less like a defendant pleading for his life and more like a patient teacher dealing with a particularly slow-witted class. He did not weep or parade his children before the court to garner sympathy, as was the custom of the time. Instead, he spoke with a calm, maddening irony, suggesting at one point that rather than being punished, he should be rewarded with free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the highest honor the city could bestow, usually reserved for Olympic victors. One can almost hear the collective gasp, followed by the rumble of irritation. For there is nothing a crowd hates more than a man who refuses to be afraid when they have the power to hurt him. Plato was there in the crowd, watching the man he loved like a father treat death as if it were nothing more than a minor philosophical inconvenience. To the young wrestler poet, the proceedings must have felt like a waking nightmare, a surreal theater where the smartest man in Greece was being judged by men who likely believed that thunder was just Zeus moving his furniture. The pebbles were cast into the urns, the bronze clattering against bronze, counting out the verdict. Guilty. The sentence was death. And here, history whispers a detail that is both a fact and a heartbreak. Plato was not present at the end. In his own writings, decades later, he would slip in a quiet, devastating line. Plato I believe, was ill. Whether it was a physical fever or a sickness of the spirit, a grief so profound that he could not bear to watch the light go out, we do not know. But his absence left a hollow space in the narrative, a silence that he would spend the rest of his life trying to fill with words. The execution itself was quiet, lacking the gore of the arena or the brutality of the battlefield. Socrates was held in a small prison cell carved into the rock of Philopappus Hill, where the sounds of the city were muffled and distant. When the sun touched the horizon, turning the sky the color of bruised plums, the jailer brought the cup of crushed hemlock. It is a slow poison, hemlock. It does not strike the heart with sudden violence, but creeps upward from the feet, a gradual numbing, a coldness that claims the body inch by inch, allowing the mind to remain lucid until the very end. Socrates drank it without a tremor, chiding his friends for crying, telling them that he was merely moving to a different place, perhaps a better one. He walked around the small cell until his legs felt heavy, then lay down, covering his face as the coldness reached his chest. His last words were not a grand proclamation of truth, but a simple reminder to pay a debt. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it. It was a final gentle joke. Asclepius was the god of healing, and one sacrificed to him upon recovering from an illness. Socrates was suggesting that death was the cure for the long sickness of life. When the news reached Plato, the impact was total. The death of Socrates did not just break his heart, it broke his reality. How could the world be just if the most just man within it could be legally murdered by a democracy? It was the moment that severed Plato from the ambitions of his youth. He had been born to lead, destined by his bloodline to stand on the pinnacles and steer the ship of state. But now he saw the ship was rotten, steered by a crew that had no knowledge of the stars. He likely burned his tragedies and poems around this time, watching the parchment curl and blacken in the fire, the smoke carrying away his artistic dreams. If poetry could not save Socrates, then poetry was useless. If politics was merely the manipulation of the ignorant by the persuasive, then politics was a trap. A profound silence descended upon him, a retreat from the public eye. The Athens he walked through now felt different. The statues seemed mocking, the debates in the agora hollow and shrill. He realized then that the physical world, the world of voting pebbles, hemlock cups, and rotting bodies, could not be the only reality. For if it were, it was a cruel and senseless joke. There had to be something else, something stable and eternal. A place where justice was not just a word tossed around by angry jurors, but a real, unchangeable form, safe from the whims of men. The trauma of that cup of poison planted the seed of what would become the theory of forms. Plato began to look away from the earth, not out of arrogance, but out of a desperate need to find a standard that human hands could not destroy. He saw that the visible world was a cave of shadows, shifting and deceptive, where men killed saints because they could not distinguish the light from the dark. And so, with the ghost of Socrates walking beside him, a ghost he would keep alive by making him the main character of his dialogues, granting him an immortality that no court could revoke, Plato turned his back on the city of his birth. He could not fix Athens, not yet. He needed to understand the architecture of the soul before he could ever hope to rebuild the architecture of a city. The young man who had once wrestled for sport now began a much harder struggle, wrestling with grief, anger, and the terrifying possibility that wisdom brings nothing but suffering. He packed his few belongings, perhaps a few scrolls and a cloak, and prepared to leave. The gates of Athens opened before him, leading out into a wider, wilder world, and as he stepped through them, he carried the silence of the prison cell within him, a quiet burden that would drive him across seas and deserts in search of a truth that did not taste like poison. To leave one's home is to leave behind the mirror in which one has always seen oneself reflected. And for Plato, stepping onto a ship bound for the southern horizon was an act of shattering that mirror completely. The Aegean Sea, famously described by poets as wine-dark, but appearing to the traveler as a deeply shifting indigo, became the fluid bridge between the wreckage of his past and the architecture of his future. He was not merely a tourist seeking exotic sights. He was a pilgrim of the mind, hungry for a kind of knowledge that Athens, in its grief and volatility, could no longer provide. The wooden hull of the ship groaned against the waves, a rhythmic lullaby of timber and rope that carried him away from the hemlock and the shouting crowds, toward lands where wisdom was not debated in the marketplace, but guarded in the silence of temples. His first destination was Egypt, a civilization so old that to the Greeks it seemed to have been born from the earth itself. If Athens was a spirited, noisy adolescent, constantly reinventing itself, Egypt was a grandfather, stern, immovable, and obsessed with eternity. When Plato arrived at the delta of the Nile, he stepped into a world of overwhelming verticality. The pyramids of Giza and the great temples of Heliopolis did not soar with the light, airy grace of Greek columns. They sat heavy upon the sand, massive geometric assertions that defied time. Here the priests shaved their heads smooth and wore white linen that dazzled in the relentless sun, moving with a slowness that suggested they operated on a different timescale entirely. It is said that Plato spent time with these priests, perhaps pretending to be an oil merchant or simply arriving as a curious scholar, though historians still argue gently over the details, whether he stayed for months or years, or whether, as some skeptics suggest, later writers simply invented this trip to give his philosophy a mystical pedigree. Yet the texture of his later work suggests he truly walked these sands. In the cool, incense-heavy shadows of Egyptian temples, Plato encountered a society that did not believe in change. For thousands of years, their art, their laws, and their rituals had remained the same, a stillness that must have felt deeply soothing to a man traumatized by political chaos. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true, where an elderly Egyptian priest looks at the inquisitive Athenian and sighs, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek." It was a gentle rebuke, but also a revelation. The Greeks were obsessed with the new, with the fresh argument, the latest play, the current war. The Egyptians were obsessed with the permanent. They taught Plato that beneath the shifting sands of daily life, there were mathematical truths that never aged. He watched as they used geometry to remeasure the farmland after the annual flooding of the Nile. The river would wash away the boundary markers, erasing the claims of men. But the geometry remained. The triangles, the squares, the ratios. They could be redrawn exactly as they were because they existed in a realm of pure logic, untouched by the floodwater. This was the spark. Here was the antidote to the poison of relativism. If justice was like a triangle, then it didn't matter what a jury thought of it. A triangle is a triangle, whether you vote for it or not. The seeds of the forms were being watered by the Nile. From the static majesty of Egypt, the traveler moved west, sailing toward the heel of Italy, to the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. If Egypt gave him the weight of stone, Italy gave him the music of the spheres. He came to Tarentum to meet the Pythagoreans, a secretive brotherhood of scholar mystics who believed that the universe was made of numbers. This was a very different kind of wisdom than the street corner questioning of Socrates. The Pythagoreans were strange, disciplined, and slightly eccentric. They refused to eat beans, believing they might contain the souls of the dead, or perhaps simply because they resembled jagged votes, a bit of ancient dietary humor that likely confused the young Athenian. But beneath their quirks lay a dazzling insight. The world is not made of stuff like water or fire, but of structure. Plato met Archytas, a philosopher king who actually ruled successfully, proving that power and wisdom could coexist. Archytas showed him that music, the thing that moves the soul most deeply, was actually math in disguise. A plucked string vibrates. Cut the string in half, and the note jumps an octave. Simple, whole number ratios created harmony. Chaotic, messy ratios created noise. It was a thunderclap of realization for Plato. The beauty we hear is just the ear's way of counting without knowing it. Suddenly, the universe seemed less like a tragic accident and more like a tuned instrument. The wandering wrestler began to see that the chaos of the visible world was just bad tuning, but the sheet music, the mathematical laws governing it, was perfect. These travels were the crucible that forged the Plato we know. He had left Athens as a Socratic moralist, worried about how men should behave. He was returning as a metaphysical architect, worried about how the universe was built. The crushing grief of Socrates' death was beginning to transmute into a grand, crystalline vision. He saw now that the physical world, the world of rotting bodies, corrupt politicians, and fading flowers, was like the shadows on the wall, or the messy vibrations of an untuned string. But behind it lay the realm of Egypt's geometry and Italy's numbers, the realm of the forms, the perfect circle, the absolute good, the eternal justice. These things were not visible to the eye, but they were visible to the mind, and unlike the flesh of a beloved teacher, they could never be poisoned. As the ship turned back toward Athens, navigating by stars that followed their own silent mathematical paths, Plato was no longer running away. He was bringing something back. He carried within him the blueprints for a new kind of fortress, not one of walls and towers, which the Spartans could tear down, but a fortress of the mind. He would build a school. He would plant a grove where men could look away from the dirt and up toward the mathematical heavens. He was returning to the city that had killed his teacher, not to burn it down, but to try, however impossibly, to heal its soul with the medicine of eternity. The water lapped against the hull, whispering of home, but the man looking out at the horizon had changed. He had gone out a student of a ghost. He was returning as the master of a new reality. The journey ends, as all journeys eventually must, not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the quiet crunch of sandals on a gravel path leading away from the city. Plato is back in Athens, but he is no longer of Athens. He has seen the pyramids and heard the mathematical music of the stars, and the bickering of the agora now sounds to him like the buzzing of flies around a stale piece of fruit. He needs a space apart, a sanctuary where the mind can stretch its wings, without hitting the walls of political prejudice. He finds it just outside the city fortifications, about a mile to the northwest, past the Dipylon Gate and through the Potter's Quarter. It is a leafy, shadowed park dedicated to an obscure local hero named Hecademos. The locals call it the Academy. It is not a building in the way we think of universities today. There are no lecture halls with tiered seating or imposing libraries of stone. It is, first and foremost, a grove. Ancient olive trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted like ringing hands, cast a dappled, silvery shade over the earth. The river Cephissus murmurs nearby, a ribbon of cool water that keeps the air moist and fragrant, feeding the plane trees that line the walking paths. It is a public gymnasium, a place where young men have long come to wrestle and exercise their bodies in the nude, glistening with oil under the Grecian sun. But Plato sees something else here. He sees a place where they might wrestle with something far more formidable than a sparring partner. He buys a small plot of adjacent land, a garden with a modest house, and effectively sets up the Western world's first think tank. It is a quiet revolution. He does not charge tuition, unlike the sophists, those traveling teachers who sell wisdom by the hour like merchants selling dried fish. Plato despises that transactional view of the soul. Instead, he establishes a thiasos, a religious confraternity dedicated to the muses. This legal maneuvering is clever. It protects the property and gives the school a sacred status. But the worship here is unlike anything Greece has seen. There are no bloody sacrifices, no frantic dancing. The offering is thought. The ritual is the relentless, exhausting, exhilarating pursuit of a logical proof. Legend tells us that above the entrance to this garden, Plato hangs a sign with a stern warning, Medeis geometretos esito. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. Historians still argue whether this physical sign actually existed, or if it was merely a metaphor that later writers turned into wood and paint. But the spirit of the warning is undeniably real. To Plato, geometry is not just a trade skill for measuring land. It is a spiritual filter. If you cannot understand that a triangle is a perfect, eternal form that exists independently of the imperfect triangle you draw in the dust, then you are not ready for philosophy. You are still trapped in the world of the senses. The academy, therefore, becomes a place of lines, angles, and circles. Picture a group of young men crouching in the dirt, not praying, but staring intensely at a diagram drawn with a stick, arguing about the nature of the hypotenuse. To an outsider, it might look dry, perhaps even boring. But to them, it is a kind of ecstasy. They are seeing the bones of the universe. The atmosphere is one of intense communal intimacy. They live together, or at least spend their entire days together, forming a bond that is stronger than family. They eat together, simple, frugal meals of figs, olives, cheese, and watered wine. Plato believes that a heavy stomach makes for a heavy mind, so the culinary scene at the academy is likely underwhelming. One can imagine a new student arriving, expecting a banquet, and being handed a single, very thoughtful olive. But the conversation is the true feast. They discuss the motion of the planets, the nature of virtue, the definition of courage. It is here that the famous Platonic love takes root. Not the non-sexual romance we use the term for today, but a ladder of desire. It starts with the attraction to a beautiful body. Yes, but the education of the academy is designed to pull that desire upward, rung by rung, from the beautiful body to the beautiful mind, from the beautiful mind to beautiful laws, and finally to the love of beauty itself, absolute and pure. It is a heady, intense environment, a greenhouse for the soul. And in this greenhouse, there are surprises hidden in the foliage. Among the sea of bearded men and athletic youths, there are whispers of others. History gives us the names of Axiothea, of Phlius, and Lasthenia, of Mantinea, women who were so drawn to Plato's new vision that they left their homes to join the academy. The sources, written by men centuries later, often claim they had to dress as men to attend, wearing the short tunic and cloak to blend in. Whether this cross-dressing was a strict requirement or a practical necessity for safety, we cannot be sure. But imagine the courage of Axiothea, slipping into the grove, her voice pitched low, standing shoulder to shoulder with the sons of aristocrats, proving by her very presence that the mind has no gender. Plato, to his credit, accepts them. In his ideal state, he will later write, "Women can be guardians just as men can, for the soul is the same." It is a radical thought, quietly planted in the shade of the olive trees, waiting centuries to fully bloom. The days in the academy fall into a rhythm that feels almost monastic. The morning is for mathematics, for sharpening the mind on the whetstone of logic. The afternoon is for dialectic, the art of conversation. This is not a lecture where the master speaks and the students take notes. It is a contact sport of ideas. Plato poses a question. What is justice? A student answers. Plato gently, methodically, destroys the answer, finding the contradiction, the loose thread. The student tries again. They walk as they talk, pacing the shady paths of the grove, their movement mirroring the movement of their thoughts. This is the pedagogy, the turning around of the soul. Plato believes that we are all like prisoners in a cave, staring at shadows, and his job is not to tell us what to see, but to grab us by the shoulders and physically turn us around to face the light. It is disorienting, it is painful, it dazzles the eyes. But once you have seen the sun, you can never be satisfied with the shadows again. As evening approaches and the cicadas begin their nightly chorus, the intensity softens. The students and the master gather for the symposium, the drinking party. But even here, the goal is not intoxication, but elevation. They recline on couches, passing the cup, and the talk turns to myths, stories that bridge the gap where logic fails. Plato spins tales of souls choosing their next lives, of charioteers struggling to control unruly horses, of a lost island called Atlantis that sank beneath the waves. The air is thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the weight of big ideas. In this secluded grove, walled off from the chaos of Athenian democracy, a new aristocracy is being formed, not of blood, but of the mind. They are preparing to save the world, or at least to understand it. And in the quiet of the night, as the lamps burn low, the academy feels less like a school and more like a ship, sailing silently through the dark, carrying the most precious cargo in human history, the belief that truth is real and that we, with enough effort, can find it. It is deep into the night now at the academy, and the noise of the crickets has risen to a deafening rhythmic thrum, drowning out the distant murmur of the city. The students are gathered in a tighter circle, their faces illuminated by the dying embers of a charcoal brazier, the orange glow dancing in their eyes. Plato leans forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, for he is about to tell a story that is not really a story, but a map of the human condition. He looks at Glaucon, his older brother, a man known for his spirited nature and love of fine dogs and birds, and asks him to imagine a strange and sorrowful prison. This is the birth of the allegory of the cave, the most famous image in the history of philosophy. Yet tonight, we do not treat it as a diagram in a textbook. We step inside it. Imagine, Plato says, a subterranean cavern, damp and cold, stretching deep into the earth. In this cave, there are human beings who have been imprisoned since childhood, but their chains are peculiar. They are fettered by their legs and necks in such a way that they cannot move, and, crucially, they can only look forward. They cannot turn their heads. They have never seen themselves, nor one another. They have never seen the opening of the cave, nor the sun that shines above it. All they have ever seen is the wall of stone directly in front of them. It is a terrifying image, a paralysis of the soul, yet Plato describes it with a calm, clinical precision. Behind these prisoners, higher up on a raised path, a fire is burning, and between the fire and the prisoners, there is a low wall, like the screen puppet showmen have in front of them. Along this wall, people, let us call them the shadow makers, walk back and forth, carrying artifacts, statues of men, figures of animals made of wood and stone, and various other objects. As they walk, they talk, their voices echoing off the cold rock. The fire casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall in front of the prisoners. And here is the tragedy. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, believe that these shadows are reality. When a shadow of a horse passes by and the carrier shouts, the prisoners believe the shadow itself is shouting. They give names to these dark shapes. They compete to see who can predict which shadow will come next, awarding honors and prizes to the sharpest eyes among them. They are experts in illusions, masters of nothing. Glaucon, listening in the olive grove, shudders and says, "It is a strange image you speak of, and strange prisoners." And Plato, with a sadness that reaches across the centuries, replies softly, "They are like us." It is a moment that stops the breath. We are the prisoners. The world we see with our eyes, the red of the rose, the blue of the sky, the chair we sit in, Plato suggests these are merely shadows cast by a higher, truer reality that we cannot yet see. We are fixated on the screen, obsessed with the flickering images of fame, wealth, and politics, mistaking them for the solid truth. But the story does not end in the dark. Plato asks us to imagine that one prisoner is suddenly released. We do not know why or by whom. Perhaps it is by force, or perhaps by a sudden, inexplicable accident of grace. He is compelled to stand up, to turn his neck, to walk, and to look up toward the light. It is not a moment of triumph. It is a moment of agony. His limbs are stiff from a lifetime of immobility. The movement causes sharp physical pain. And the light, even the dim light of the fire, burns his eyes, which are accustomed only to the gloom. He is dazzled, confused, and angry. If someone were to tell him that the objects passing on the wall are real and the shadows he used to watch were trumpery, he wouldn't believe it. He would long to sit back down and watch the comfortable, familiar shadows. It is easier to be a prisoner than to be free. But he is dragged by force up the rough, steep ascent, out of the cave and into the light of the sun. This part of the journey represents education, not the pleasant accumulation of facts, but the violent, disorienting process of being pulled out of ignorance. When he finally emerges into the upper world, he is completely blinded. The sun is too bright. He cannot see a single one of the things he is now told are true. At first, he can only look at shadows and reflections in the water. Then gradually, as his eyes adjust, he can look at the objects themselves, the real trees, the real flowers, the solid earth. Finally, he can look at the stars and the moon by night, and at last, he can look at the sun itself. He realizes that the sun is the cause of everything, the seasons, the years, the visibility of the world. In Plato's language, the sun is the form of the good, the ultimate source of all truth and existence. The former prisoner is filled with pity for his friends down in the cave. The honors they give each other for guessing the shadows seem ridiculous to him now. He would rather, as Homer said, be a dirt-poor servant in the house of a landless man than live like that again. But the story has a final, darker turn, one that reveals the scar tissue on Plato's own heart. The freed man decides to return. He cannot leave his fellow prisoners in the dark. He descends back into the cave to tell them the truth. But coming out of the sunlight, his eyes are now ruined for the darkness. He stumbles. He cannot see the shadows as well as he used to. He looks foolish, clumsy, and slow. The prisoners laugh at him. They say that his journey upward has ruined his eyesight, and that it is better not to even think of ascending. They mock his tales of a sun and real trees. And Plato adds, in a whisper that chills the warm air of the academy, if he were to try to free them and lead them up, and if they could somehow get their hands on him, they would kill him. Here, the ghost of Socrates enters the story. The prisoners are the jury of Athens. The clumsy, blinded man is the philosopher who tried to show them the light. They killed him because he disturbed their shadows. It is a warning to every student sitting in that circle. The path of wisdom is not safe. It estranges you from the crowd. It makes you look foolish to those who are experts in the mundane. Historians and scholars have long debated the exact mechanics of the cave, some arguing that the puppeteers represent the poets and playwrights of Athens, whom Plato deeply distrusted, manipulating the emotions of the public with fictions. Others suggest they are the politicians, casting shadows of fear and patriotism to control the masses. But in the quiet of the night, the specific allegory matters less than the feeling it evokes. It is the feeling of waking up. It is the haunting suspicion that there is more than this. As Plato finishes the tale, the fire in the brazier has burned down to ash. The shadows in the olive grove are long and deep. The students are silent, looking at the darkness around them with new eyes, wondering if the trees they see are real, or if they are still waiting to be dragged up the steep slope. The air feels thinner, charged with a strange electricity. The boundary between the world of the senses and the world of the mind has been blurred. And somewhere in the back of the group, a young student from the north who has been listening intently shifts his weight. He is not entirely convinced that the world we see is a prison. He looks at the ash, the olive leaves, the stars, and he sees not a trap, but a clue. His name is Aristotle, and though he loves the master, he is beginning to wonder if the truth might be found not by leaving the cave, but by exploring it more deeply. The seasons turned over the academy, the olive harvest giving way to the cold rains of winter and the wild flowers of spring, until the year 367 BC arrived. It was a year that would quietly alter the trajectory of human thought, marked not by a battle or a coronation, but by the arrival of a 17-year-old boy at the city gates. He came from the north, from a small coastal town called Stagaira on the Chalcidic Peninsula, a place where the wild mountains of Macedonia met the sea. His name was Aristotle. To the refined, high-born Athenians, the north was a place of semi-barbarism, a land of timber, rugged horses, and kings who drank their wine undiluted, a scandalous breach of etiquette in polite Greek society. But this young man was no barbarian. He was the son of Nicomachus, the court physician to the king of Macedon. This lineage is the key that unlocks the door to his mind. While Plato had grown up in the house of politicians, surrounded by debates about justice and law, Aristotle had grown up in the house of a doctor, surrounded by jars of herbs, surgical instruments, and the visceral reality of the human body. In the ancient world, medicine was often a family trade, a secret knowledge passed from father to son in the guild of the Asclepiads. It is highly likely that as a boy, Aristotle watched his father work, learning early on that truth was not found in abstract contemplation, but in the messy, bloody, specific details of physical life. A doctor cannot afford to theorize about a perfect, abstract fever. He must treat the sweating, shivering patient right in front of him. He must look at the color of the urine, feel the pulse, and smell the breath. He must trust his senses, or his patient will die. So, when young Aristotle walked through the Dipylon Gate and into the winding streets of Athens, he brought with him a pair of eyes that saw the world very differently from the mystics and mathematicians already gathered in the olive grove. He saw a world to be diagnosed, not transcended. He was, by all accounts, a striking figure, though perhaps not in the traditional heroic mold. Ancient gossip, delightfully petty even after 2 millennia, tells us he had thin legs and small eyes, and that he spoke with a slight lisp, a stammer that softened his sharp intellect. But he compensated for this with a flair for fashion that lightly raised a few eyebrows among the ascetics of the academy, while Plato and his followers tended toward a simple, almost austere appearance. Fitting for men who wanted to leave the body behind, Aristotle is said to have worn rings on his fingers and kept his hair fashionably short and well-trimmed. He appreciated elegance. He enjoyed the finer things. There is a gentle humor in imagining him walking into the dusty, severe atmosphere of the academy, perhaps adjusting a strictly unnecessary piece of jewelry, looking around with the bright, terrifying intelligence of a man who intends to read every single book in the library. He did not come as a beggar. Both his parents had died when he was young, leaving him with a substantial inheritance and a guardian who saw his potential. He came as a paying member of the intellectual elite, hungry for the best education the world could offer. And in 367 BC, there was no doubt where that was. The academy was not just a school, it was the center of the known universe for the mind. But there was a twist of fate in his arrival. When Aristotle first stepped into the grove, the master was not there. Plato had gone to Sicily, embarking on a doomed political adventure to tutor a tyrant, leaving the school in the hands of his deputy, Eudoxus. This might have been a blessing in disguise. It gave the young northern colt, as he would later be called, time to graze freely, to absorb the mathematics and the astronomy of the curriculum without immediately falling under the overwhelming shadow of Plato's personality. For 20 years, Aristotle would remain at the academy. It is a staggering amount of time, longer than a modern childhood, longer than most careers. Historians often gloss over this, jumping straight to their disagreements. But we must pause to feel the weight of those 2 decades. He did not stay because he was trapped. He stayed because he loved it. He became the Academy's most voracious reader, a man who collected scrolls with an obsessive passion in an era when books were rare and precious objects. Plato, upon returning and seeing this ferocious appetite for learning, is said to have nicknamed him the mind of the school. It was a compliment, but perhaps one with a slight edge, a recognition that this young man's intellect was a force of nature, something powerful, distinct, and perhaps eventually uncontainable. Imagine the first time they truly met. Plato, now in his 60s, a man of immense presence, broad-shouldered and white-bearded, carrying the weight of his failures in Sicily and the height of his visions in his eyes. And Aristotle, barely 20, sharp, lisping, dressed a bit too well, holding a scroll of biological observations. The meeting of these two was the collision of 2 tectonic plates. Plato pointed up, to the eternal forms, to the geometry that organized the stars. Aristotle looked down, to the biology that organized the grass, to the sea urchins, to the logic of how things grow and change. It was not a clash of enemies, but a harmony of opposites, a counterpoint that would enrich the school for years. Aristotle did not reject Plato's teachings. He devoured them, memorized them, and then, with the inevitable audacity of genius, began to test them against the hard surface of reality. There is a scholarly debate that lingers here, soft as a whisper in the library stacks. Some historians argue that Aristotle began as a devoted Platonist, writing dialogues in his master's style, fully believing in the theory of forms, and only gradually drifted away in his later years. Others believe the doctor's son was a skeptic from the start, a friendly critic who sat in the back row, raising his hand with the "yes, but" questions that drive teachers mad. The truth, as usual, likely lies in the human middle. He was a student who revered his teacher, but who loved the truth more. There is a famous saying attributed to him later in life: Amicus Plato sed magis amica veritas. Plato is my friend, but truth is a better friend. But in those early days, the friendship came first. The sun sets over the academy, casting long shadows through the plane trees. The students are dispersing, their debates trailing off into the evening air. Aristotle remains behind for a moment, watching the light fade. He is far from home, a foreigner in a city that prides itself on its autochthony, its myth of springing from the very soil of Attica. He will never be a citizen of Athens. He will always be a resident alien, a metic with no right to vote or own property. This outsider status will define him. It will give him a detachment, a coolness of observation that the passionate, politically entangled Athenians lack. He is not here to save the city's soul. He is here to understand how the machine of the universe works. He adjusts his cloak, picks up a scroll, and walks toward the library. The reader has arrived, and the long, slow conversation that will define Western civilization has just begun. To enter the house of the reader is to step into a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of the olive grove, which is open to the wind and the birds, nor the silence of the temple, which waits for a god to speak. It is a dry, rustling silence, smelling faintly of the Nile and the glue of the marshlands. In the ancient world, books were not the compact, bound rectangles we hold today, but scrolls of papyrus, long, fragile sheets, made from reeds hammered together and dried in the Egyptian sun. To read was a physical act, a two-handed labor of unrolling the future with the right hand while rolling up the past with the left, a constant movement that mirrored the flow of time itself. Aristotle was the first man in history who we can truly call a collector of books. While other men collected tripods, horses, or political favors, the young doctor's son collected thoughts. He bought scrolls with a hunger that bordered on the obsessive, amassing a personal library that would become legendary in Athens. Plato, observing this young student surrounded by piles of papyrus, is said to have given him a new nickname, Anagnostes, the reader. In the context of the time, this was a complex label, carrying a mixture of admiration and a subtle, teasing critique. For in the golden age of Greece, wisdom was not something you pulled off a shelf. It was something you spoke, something you argued, something that lived in the breath and the air between two people. This brings us to one of the great paradoxes of history, a tension that vibrated in the air between the master and the student. Plato is one of the most gifted writers who ever lived. His dialogues are masterpieces of literature, dramatic and poetic, capturing the nuances of conversation with absolute brilliance. And yet, Plato deeply distrusted writing. In one of his most beautiful dialogues, the Phaedrus, he tells a myth about the invention of letters. He describes the Egyptian god, Theoth, who proudly presents the art of writing to the king, claiming it is a potion for memory and wisdom. But the king shakes his head. "You have not found a cure for memory, but for reminding," the king says. "You will give your students the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. They will read many things without instruction, and will therefore seem to know many things when they are for the most part ignorant." To Plato, a book was a dead thing. He complained that if you ask a painting a question, it stands in majestic silence. The same is true of written words. They seem to talk to you as if they were intelligent. But if you ask them anything about what they say from a desire to be instructed, they go on telling you just the same thing forever. A book cannot defend itself. It cannot adapt its answer to the soul of the listener. It drifts all over the place, getting into the hands of people who have no business reading it, helpless and orphaned, without its author to protect it. For Plato, true philosophy was oral. It was the living word, written not in ink, but in the soul of the learner. It required presence. It required the fire of the eye and the immediate challenge of the dialectic. Writing was merely a pastime, a way to store notes for old age, a shadow of the real conversation. But Aristotle represented the turning of the tide. He was the harbinger of the literate age. He did not share this aristocratic disdain for the written record. Where Plato saw a dead object, Aristotle saw a data point. To him, a library was not a graveyard of silence. It was a laboratory of opinions. He realized that if we are to understand the world, we cannot simply start from scratch every morning with our own intuitions. We must know what others have thought before us. We must stand on the mountain of previous errors to reach the peak of truth. And so, while Plato gazed into the fire of the symposium, seeking the one eternal truth, Aristotle was often found in his quarters, lamp oil burning low, unrolling the dusty, difficult treatises of the pre-Socratics, men like Heraclitus, Empedocles, and Democritus. He read everything. He read the brilliant poetry, but he also read the dry medical lists, the records of Olympic victors, the local constitutions of small cities, and the bad plays that everyone else had forgotten. He treated these texts with a new kind of respect, not as holy scripture to be believed without question, but as endoxa, reputable opinions that had to be sifted, analyzed, and catalogued. This was the birth of the academic method. When you open a modern textbook and see a review of literature at the beginning of a chapter, you are seeing the ghost of Aristotle. He was the first to realize that knowledge is a collective project, a massive, multi-generational conversation that requires minutes to be taken. He was the secretary of the human race. He organized his scrolls not by how beautifully they were written, but by subject. Biology here, poetry there, politics in the corner. He was building a mental map of the universe, and he needed every scrap of information he could find to fill in the blank spaces. There is a gentle humor in imagining the dynamic between them. The majestic, broad-shouldered Plato, walking in the garden, speaking of the flight of the soul to the hyper-Uranian, the place beyond the heavens, while the slight, dapper Aristotle trails behind, holding a scroll, interrupting to ask, "Yes, master, but what about what Anaxagoras said regarding the composition of bone marrow?" It was the clash between the poet and the professor. Plato wanted to change your life. Aristotle wanted to organize your knowledge. Yet, we must not make the mistake of thinking Aristotle was a dry pedant. He loved these books because he possessed a curiosity so burning it consumed everything in its path. He read because he wanted to know why. Why does the sun rise? Why do bees dance? Why do tragedies make us cry? He believed the answers were hidden in the fragments of the past, waiting for a mind sharp enough to piece them together. Historians and anthropologists today point to this moment in the academy as the great pivot point in Greek culture. The shift from an oral culture, where truth is performance and memory is an art form, to a literate culture, where truth is analysis and memory is externalized on papyrus. Plato stood on the shore of the old world, the world of Homer and Socrates, where wisdom was a song sung by the elders. Aristotle stood on the shore of the new world, the world of the encyclopedia and the dissertation. And for 20 years, these two worlds coexisted in the same olive grove. They ate at the same table. They loved the same wisdom. Plato, despite his grumbling about writing, must have respected the sheer industrial power of Aristotle's mind. He saw that while he was painting the ceiling of the Cathedral of Thought, Aristotle was busy inspecting the foundation stones, checking for cracks, measuring the stress loads, ensuring the whole thing wouldn't collapse. The reader continued to read. Scroll after scroll, year after year, the piles grew higher in his room. He was digesting the Greek world, breaking it down into its constituent parts, matter and form, substance and accident, potentiality and actuality. He was preparing to write his own books, but they would be very different from Plato's. They would not be dramatic dialogues with characters and settings. They would be lecture notes, dense, difficult, jagged, and brilliant. They would lack the poetry of the Republic, but they would possess a muscular grip on reality that poetry often lacks. As the wind rustled the leaves of the plane trees outside, sounding like the turning of a million pages, Aristotle sat in the yellow light of his lamp, reading. He was learning how to take the world apart, so that one day he could teach us how to put it back together. It is said that if you understand the gesture of two hands, you understand the entire history of Western philosophy. Although the famous painting by Raphael that depicts this moment will not be painted for another 1800 years. The spirit of the image is already alive in the dusty sunlight of the academy. Imagine them walking side by side, the old master, Plato, with his beard like a tumbling waterfall of white, and the younger man, Aristotle, sharp-eyed and grounding his steps firmly on the earth. In the painting, Plato points one finger upward, toward the sky, toward the vault of the heavens. It is a gesture of vertical longing. He is telling us that the truth is up there, in the realm of the forms, perfect, invisible, and unchanging. But Aristotle walks beside him with his palm held flat, facing the earth, hovering just above the ground. It is a gesture of horizontal presence. He is telling us that the truth is right here, embedded in the messy, beautiful physical stuff of the world. Over the course of their 20 years together, this difference in posture hardened into a fundamental divergence that would split the human mind into two camps. The debate was about where reality actually lives. For Plato, the physical world was a disappointment. Look at a flower. It blooms, it is beautiful for a day, and then it wilts, turns brown, and rots. It is unstable. It is a becoming thing, not a being thing. If you try to pin your happiness or your knowledge on a flower, you will be left holding a handful of dust. Therefore, Plato argued, the real flower, the form of the flower, must exist in a non-physical realm, safe from time and decay. The flower in your hand is just a ghostly copy, a shadow cast by that eternal pattern. This view offers a profound emotional comfort. It whispers that nothing true is ever lost, that the things we love have an eternal version that death cannot touch. But Aristotle, walking with his hand flat, looked at the same flower and saw something completely different. He did not see a disappointment. He saw a miracle of engineering. He saw a living substance, an ousia, that contained its own rules of existence. To Aristotle, the form of the flower was not floating in some heaven. It was right there, inside the plant. It was the blueprint encoded in the seed, the driving force that made the roots go down and the stem go up. If you destroyed every flower on earth, Aristotle argued, the form of the flower would vanish too, because forms cannot exist without matter to hold them. This was the great heresy, the looking down. It was a rejection of the separate world. Aristotle was effectively saying to his master, I love you, but you are doubling the universe unnecessarily. You are inventing a ghost world to explain the real one, when the real one is perfectly capable of explaining itself if you just look close enough. This philosophical tug-of-war is often taught as a dry battle of logic, but in the intimate setting of the academy, it must have been personal, perhaps even playful at times. One can imagine Aristotle bringing a specimen to the table, a starfish or the jawbone of a donkey, and asking, Master, where is the eternal form of this? Is there a form of the donkey in the heavens? And is there a form of the dust that sits on the donkey? And a form of the mud? It was the third man argument, a logical critique that suggests if you need a form to explain a man, you need another form to explain the relationship between the man and the form, and so on, ad infinitum. It was a headache for the Platonists. It forced them to admit that their beautiful heaven was getting crowded with the forms of very trivial, dirty things. Yet, Plato likely smiled at the young man's persistence. He might have seen Aristotle's obsession with the physical world not as a mistake, but as a stage of development. A brilliant boy fascinated by the toys in the nursery, not yet ready to leave the room. But Aristotle was not playing. He was developing a new way of seeing, one that honored the dignity of the particular. For Plato, the specific details of your life, your grey eyes, your scar, your specific laugh, were accidents, imperfections to be stripped away to find the essential human. For Aristotle, those details were the texture of reality. The universal only existed in the particular. You couldn't have redness without a red apple or a red cloak. This shift in gaze changed everything. It meant that to find God or truth, you didn't need to close your eyes and meditate. You needed to open them and dissect. It validated the study of the mundane. It made it a holy act to count the legs of a fly or track the phases of the moon. The tension between up and down also shaped their views on the soul, the very question that haunts us in the quiet hours. For Plato, the soul was a traveler, trapped in a body like an oyster in a shell, longing to fly back to the stars. Death was a liberation, a breaking of the chains. But for Aristotle, the soul was the form of the body. It was not a ghost in a machine. It was the way the machine worked. The soul was to the body what sight is to the eye. If you take the sight away, it's no longer an eye, just a ball of jelly. If you take the soul away, it's no longer a body, just a corpse. This meant that for Aristotle, the soul and body were terrified lovers, inextricably bound. You couldn't just peel them apart. This made death a much more final, much more serious event for the Aristotelians. It wasn't a flight home. It was the breaking of the beautiful, complex unity that made a person who they were. It gave a tragic weight to his philosophy, a sense that this life, this biological pulse, is where the action is. Historians still argue about how much friction this caused. Did the academy split into factions? Did the mathematicians mock the biologists for bringing smelling fish into the sacred grove? We don't know for sure, but the silence of the sources suggests a remarkable tolerance. It seems the academy was big enough for both visions. It was a place where you could look up at the geometry of the stars in the morning and look down at the anatomy of a lizard in the afternoon. And perhaps this is the true genius of that ancient school. It understood that the human spirit needs both directions. We have days where we need Plato, where the world is too harsh, and we need to believe in a perfect, eternal realm where justice is real and loved ones are waiting. And we have days where we need Aristotle, where we want to feel the earth under our feet, to taste the wine, to solve the puzzle in front of us, to find meaning in the here and now. The up and the down are not just philosophical positions. They are the systole and diastole of the human heart, pumping the blood of wonder through our veins. As the sun dipped lower, painting the Parthenon in distance with strokes of violet and rose, the two men would walk back from the fields, the white-bearded mystic and the sharp-eyed scientist, bound together by the love of the question, leaving us to wonder which hand we follow when the lights go out. While the academy thrives in its quiet isolation, a different kind of silence, the heavy, velvet silence of a waiting trap, is forming across the sea in Sicily. It is a strange compulsion of the intellectual mind to believe that power will listen to reason, a dream that has seduced thinkers from the ancient world to the modern day. Plato, now in his 60s, comfortably established as the sage of Athens, receives a summons that he cannot ignore. It comes from Syracuse, the wealthiest, most decadent, and most dangerous city in the Greek world. Syracuse is everything Athens is not. It is a city of tyrants, of mercenaries, of feasts that last for days, and of gold that flows like water. The summons comes from Dion, Plato's most beloved student and close friend, a man of severe virtue living in a court of vipers. The old tyrant is dead, Dion writes, and his son Dionysius II now sits on the throne. The boy is young, malleable, and eager for glory. If Plato comes now, if he brings the light of philosophy to this dark palace, perhaps he can mold this young autocrat into the world's first philosopher king. It is the central dream of Plato's republic come to life. The idea that the world will only know peace when political power and philosophical wisdom are fused in the same person. It is a dazzling, seductive possibility. If Plato refuses, he admits that his philosophy is merely a parlor game for idle men in a garden. If he goes, he risks his life. With a heavy heart, driven by duty rather than desire, the old master boards the ship once more, leaving the safety of the olive grove for the shark-infested waters of court politics. When Plato arrives in Syracuse, he steps into a world of overwhelming sensory assault. The palace is a fortress of marble and paranoia, perched on the island of Ortygia. It smells of roasting meats, expensive perfumes, and the metallic tang of fear. He is greeted not as a savior, but as a curiosity, a celebrity intellectual imported to amuse the young king. Dionysius II is a fascinating, tragic figure, a young man with a vague desire to be good, but a much stronger desire to be praised. He wants the reputation of wisdom without the agony of acquiring it. For a brief, surreal season, philosophy becomes the fashion of the court. It is one of history's most absurd and delightful images. Imagine the floors of the tyrant's palace, usually polished to a shine for dancing, now covered in a layer of fine sand. Why? So that Plato can draw geometric diagrams. The entire court, desperate to curry favor with the king, suddenly feigns a deep passion for isosceles triangles. Generals, spies, and sycophants can be seen kneeling in the dust, frowning intensely at diagrams they do not understand, nodding sagely as the old Athenian explains the nature of the good. It is a comedy of manners, but the laughter is brittle. Beneath the geometry lessons, the knives are being sharpened. The older courtiers, the men of war and commerce, look at this white-bearded intruder with deep suspicion. They whisper to the young king that Plato is not teaching him wisdom. He is teaching him weakness. They suggest that the geometry is a trick to distract him, while Dion, the stern uncle, prepares to seize the throne. The atmosphere in the palace shifts from curiosity to hostility. The sand is swept away. The lessons stop. Plato finds himself in a gilded cage. He is technically a guest, but in reality, he is a prisoner of the king's volatile mood. The young tyrant's love for philosophy turns into a jealous, possessive obsession. He wants to possess Plato like a rare statue. He banishes Dion, accusing him of treason, but refuses to let Plato leave, keeping him in the palace like a pet bird. The failure of the philosopher-king experiment is collapsing in slow motion. Plato realizes too late that you cannot graft virtue onto a soul that has no roots in discipline. He sees that the royal soul is often too diseased by flattery to ever be cured by truth. It is a bitter lesson, one that perhaps makes him think of Aristotle back in Athens. Aristotle, with his interest in biological constraints, might have warned him, "You cannot teach a wolf to be a vegetarian by showing it diagrams of vegetables. Nature has its limits. The tension culminates in a period of genuine danger where the most famous philosopher in the world has to rely on the intervention of Archytas, his Pythagorean friend from Tarentum, to send a warship to negotiate his release. It is a humbling rescue. The man who wrote the blueprint for the perfect society has to be bailed out by a man who actually runs a real one. This Sicilian disaster is not just a biographical footnote. It is a turning point in the history of political thought. It marks the moment when the idealistic vision of the Republic crashes against the hard rocks of reality. Historians and scholars still argue over the authenticity of the seventh letter, a document purportedly written by Plato detailing this nightmare. In it, the voice is not of a soaring mystic, but of a tired, disillusioned man explaining that he went only because he was ashamed to be seen as mere words. If genuine, it is the most human confession of antiquity. It reveals the vulnerability of the sage. He returns to Athens, not with a kingdom transformed, but with his life barely intact. The failure haunts him. It pushes his later writing toward a darker, more rigid view of law. If men cannot be made wise, he concludes, then they must be ruled by iron laws. The Statesman and the Laws, his later works, lack the poetic fire of his youth. They are the works of a man who has seen the inside of a tyrant's mind and recoiled. Back in the academy, the return of the master must have been a quiet affair. He walks through the gates, the dust of Syracuse still on his sandals, and sees the peace of the grove. The students are there, arguing, riding, thinking. And there is Aristotle, arguably the most brilliant of them all, watching. One has to wonder if Aristotle looked at the failed expedition and quietly noted it as a data point. Observation. The theoretical ideal fails when applied to recalcitrant matter. It likely reinforced Aristotle's conviction that politics is not about creating a utopia from scratch, but about managing the imperfect, messy reality of human communities. The contrast is stark. Plato tried to change the world from the top down, and the world broke his heart. Aristotle will soon begin to study politics from the bottom up, collecting constitutions, studying how real cities actually work, accepting that the goal is not the perfect city, but simply a city that doesn't kill its citizens. The sun sets on the academy and the shadows lengthen. The old eagle has returned to his nest, his wings clipped, but his eyes still burning. He will not travel again. He will spend his remaining years here, in the garden he planted, surrounded by the minds he cultivated. The failure in Sicily is a heavy stone in his pocket, but it serves as an anchor. It grounds the school. It is a reminder that the cave is not easily escaped, and that those who go down to help the prisoners often end up in chains themselves. The dream of the philosopher king fades into the twilight, leaving behind a simpler, harder task: the education of the next generation. And among that next generation, the Stagirite is ready. He has watched the master reach for the sun and get burned. Now he prepares to light his own lamp, one that will shine not on the distant forms, but on the path right in front of our feet. The silence of the night returns, but it is a silence heavy with the knowledge that wisdom is not enough to save us. It is only the beginning of the struggle. Time, which Plato taught, was merely the moving image of eternity, eventually claims even those who understand its illusion. The year is 347 BC, and the master of the academy has reached the age of 80. In the ancient world, where a simple fever or a bad tooth could end a life in days, reaching such an age was seen as a sign of divine favor, a confirmation that the soul had lived in harmony with the cosmos. Plato's final years were quiet, spent not in the dramatic wrestling matches of the dialectic, but in the slow, meticulous drafting of his longest and final work. The laws, the fire of the Republic, had cooled into the rigid, protective structures of a man who wanted to leave nothing to chance. He walked the paths of the olive grove more slowly now, his back slightly bent, leaning on a cane of polished wood, surrounded by a hush of reverence. To the students, he was no longer just a teacher. He was a living monument, a link to the golden age of Pericles and Socrates. He was the last great oak standing in a forest that had been thinned by war and time. The end came with the gentleness of a leaf detaching from a branch in late autumn. There are many legends about the death of Plato, for history abhors a vacuum and rushes to fill the final moments of great men with symbolic meaning. Some Roman writers, centuries later, would claim he died of a lice infestation, a grotesque invention likely created by his enemies to mock his purity. Others whispered that he died in his sleep, dreaming he was a swan flying away from the hunter's net. But the most enduring and poignant story tells us that he died at a wedding feast. Imagine the scene, the soft glow of oil lamps, the smell of roasted lamb and wine, the low murmur of conversation. The old philosopher, tired from the noise, withdrew to a quiet corner to rest. As he lay there, drifting between waking and sleeping, a Thracian flute girl began to play a sweet, rhythmic tune. It is said that even in his final moments, his fingers moved slightly, tapping out the rhythm, checking the mathematical ratio of the music. He was correcting the universe until his last breath. He slipped away, not in agony, but in appreciation of harmony. When the guests went to wake him, they found that the broad-shouldered one had finally laid down his burden. The soul had flown back to the star from which it came, leaving the heavy, imperfect clay behind. The funeral was a solemn event that stopped the breath of the intellectual world. He was buried on the grounds of the academy, in the very soil he had sanctified with thought. The grave was simple, for a man who believed the body was a prison needs no elaborate monument to mark the cell he has escaped. But as the earth was smoothed over and the libations of wine and honey were poured, a heavy silence settled over the school. It was the silence of a vacuum. For 40 years, Plato had been the sun around which their minds orbited. Now the sun was gone, and the planets were left to drift in the cold. The question that hung in the air, unspoken at the graveside, but shouted in the private whispers of the dormitories, was simple and terrifying. Who comes next? By all metrics of merit, the answer was obvious. Aristotle was the mind of the school. He had been there for 20 years. He had written treatises, taught rhetoric, and engaged the master in the deepest debates. He was the intellectual heir, the only one capable of carrying the heavy shield of Platonic thought. But in Athens, merit often bowed to blood and law. Here, we brush against a hard historical truth that determined the course of philosophy. The academy was not a public institution. It was private property. It was a house and a garden owned by a citizen. And Aristotle, the brilliant doctor's son from the north, was a metic, a resident alien. Under Athenian law, He could not own land. He could not legally inherit the school. This legal technicality, dry as dust, changed the world. The leadership of the academy passed not to the genius from Stagira, but to Speusippus, Plato's nephew. Speusippus was a capable mathematician, a man who loved numbers more than he loved the physical world. He was safe. He was family. He was Athenian. But to Aristotle, the decision must have felt like a sharp, cold slap. It was a reminder that no matter how many books he read, no matter how perfectly he mastered the dialectic, he would always be an outsider. He was the guest who had stayed too long. The atmosphere of the academy began to change almost immediately. Speusippus turned the focus inward toward pure Pythagorean number theory, moving away from the messy biological investigations that Aristotle loved. The broad, inclusive river of Plato's thought was being channeled into a narrow canal of mathematics. The looking down was no longer welcome in the house of looking up. Historians still argue whether Aristotle left in anger or in sorrow. Did he storm out, insulted by the nepotism? Or did he simply realize, with his characteristic rationality, that the experiment was over? There is no record of a public fight. Aristotle was too disciplined for a tantrum, but the timing suggests a clean break. Shortly after Speusippus took the helm, Aristotle packed his trunks. He did not travel alone. Xenocrates, another senior student, left with him, suggesting a shared dissatisfaction with the new regime. It was the first great schism in the Church of Reason. As Aristotle walked out of the academy gates, perhaps for the last time, he left behind his youth. He left behind the olive trees where he had walked with the man he loved and fought with for 2 decades. He was 37 years old. In the ancient world, this was middle age. He had no job, no school, and no city to call his own. The safety of the nest was gone. The eagle had fallen, and the eaglet was being pushed out of the eyrie to fly or fall on his own. He looked to the east, across the Aegean, toward the coast of Asia Minor. There were rumors of a former student, Hermias, who had become a ruler of a small city-state called Atanius and was inviting philosophers to his court. It was a chance to start over. The departure was quiet. Athens did not mourn his leaving. It barely noticed. The city was busy with its own decline, worrying about the rising power of Macedon in the north. They did not know that the man walking away, his sandals kicking up the dust of the road, carried in his head the seeds of a new science that would eventually overshadow even the academy. He walked away from the realm of the forms, away from the ghost of Socrates, and toward the wild, unmapped territory of the real world. The sun beat down on his shoulders, not a metaphorical sun, but the hot, physical star of the Mediterranean summer. He was free. And for a mind like his, freedom was both a terrifying void and a blank page waiting to be written. The wind from the sea smelled of salt and possibility. The reader was about to become the traveler. The ship that carried Aristotle away from the Attic coast did not feel like a vessel of defeat, but rather one of discovery. He was sailing toward the dawn, toward the rugged, sun-scorched coastline of Asia Minor. His destination was Atanius, a city-state ruled by an old academy companion named Hermias. Hermias was a fascinating character, a former slave who had risen to become a ruler, proving that even in a world of rigid bloodlines, the mind could carve out its own destiny. But Aristotle did not linger long in the marble halls of the palace. His eyes were drawn further out, to the edge of the world where the land met the water. He moved to the island of Lesbos, settling in the town of Mytilene, nestled against the shimmering lagoon of Pyrrha. Here, the philosopher became something the world had never seen before, the first true field biologist. If Plato's soul was a bird seeking the sky, Aristotle's soul at this moment was a tide pool creature, fascinated by the rhythm of the waves and the secrets hidden in the muck. Historians still argue whether this period was a retreat from the failure of the academy or the most productive sabbatical in human history. For it was here, on the shores of a quiet lagoon, that the foundations of modern science were laid. Imagine the dapper, thin-legged philosopher, once the most fashionable dresser in Athens, now wading into the salt marsh with his robes tucked up around his knees. Gone were the abstract discussions of the form of the fish. In their place was a man holding a wet, wriggling octopus, counting its suckers with a steady hand. He spent his days with the local fishermen, men whose skin was tanned to the color of old leather and whose hands smelled of brine and scales. He did not look down on them. Instead, he treated them as fellow researchers. He listened to their stories of the torpedo fish that could numb a man's arm, and the way the cuttlefish changed its color to match the shadows of the rocks. To the fisherman, he was likely a strange, harmless eccentric, a city man who asked too many questions about the internal organs of a sea urchin. But Aristotle was doing something revolutionary. He was trusting the senses. He was asserting that the shadows in the cave were not a distraction from the truth, but the very path to it. He began to collect specimens with a feverish intensity. His rooms in Mytilene must have resembled a chaotic museum, filled with jars of preserving vinegar, dried shells, and sketches of anatomy. He noticed things that no one else had bothered to record in writing. He discovered that whales and dolphins were not fish, but mammals that breathed air and nursed their young, a fact that would be forgotten by many for nearly 2,000 years until the Renaissance. He watched the development of a chick inside an egg, breaking one open each day to see the heart begin to beat, a tiny pulsing red dot in the center of the yolk. He was looking for the soul, not as a celestial visitor, but as the entelechy, the internal drive of a living thing to reach its own perfection. The soul of the acorn is to become the oak. The soul of the embryo is to become the man. In the lagoon of Pyrrha, the abstract forms of Plato came down to earth and became biological blueprints. There is a gentle humor in this transition. Imagine a former student from the academy visiting him, expecting a lecture on the transcendent good, only to find Aristotle elbow deep in the viscera of a dead shark, excitedly pointing out the placement of the gallbladder. He was discovering that there is beauty even in the lowly things. In one of his most moving passages from this time, he wrote that we should not recoil with childish aversion from the examination of the humbler animals, for in every work of nature there is something of the marvelous. He was teaching us that the universe does not just exist in the grand movements of the stars, but in the tiny, intricate valves of a mollusk's heart. He was finding the divine in the details. This period was also one of emotional grounding. In the court of Hermias, Aristotle had met a woman named Pythias, the niece, or perhaps adopted daughter, of the ruler. They married, and by all accounts, it was a union of deep affection. In a world where marriage was often a cold transaction of property, Aristotle's later writings on the friendship between a husband and wife carry a warmth that suggests a lived reality. Pythias accompanied him in his studies, perhaps helping him label his jars or organize his growing mountains of notes. The reader was no longer a solitary figure in a library. He was a man with a family, a man whose philosophy was being tempered by the domestic rhythms of life, the shared meals, the worries over a child's health, the quiet companionship of a partner. However, the political shadows were never far away. The kingdom of Macedon under King Philip II was expanding like a rising tide, and Aristotle's connection to the Macedonian court made him a person of interest when the Persians captured Hermias, torturing him to death to find out the secrets of his alliances. Aristotle was devastated. He wrote a poem, an ode to virtue, to honor his fallen friend, a rare moment of public emotion from a man usually guarded by logic. It was a reminder that even the most objective observer is tied to the world by the fragile threads of love and loyalty. He fled Lesbos, carrying his pregnant wife and his boxes of fish bones and scrolls, moving once more across the water. He was now a man in his early 40s, his hair beginning to thin, his mind a vast organized warehouse of the natural world. He had proven that one could find meaning without the forms, that the earth was a text waiting to be read. But he was about to receive an invitation that would pull him out of the tide pools and back into the center of the storm. King Philip of Macedon wanted a tutor for his son, a wild, high-strung boy named Alexander. The doctor's son was being called home to the palace where he had grown up, not to heal the sick, but to shape the mind of the boy who would soon break the world in half. As the ship sailed north, Aristotle must have looked back at the receding lagoon of Pyrrha, a place of quiet, stinging salt air and the slow pulse of the tides. He was leaving the world of what is to confront the world of what might be. The scientist was about to become a kingmaker, and the two visions of the soul, the ideal and the real, were about to meet the most powerful force of all, ambition. The move from the tranquil, salt-misted lagoon of Lesbos to the iron-scented court of Bela was a transition between two different species of reality. In the north, the air was sharper, carrying the scent of mountain pine and the heavy, musky odor of the royal stables. This was the heart of Macedonia, a land that the polished Athenians still viewed as a rough-hewn frontier of hunters and warriors. King Philip II, a man who had spent his life transforming a fragmented kingdom into a military juggernaut, knew that blood and steel were not enough to sustain an empire. He needed the prestige of the South, the Grecian Polish, that only the finest mind of the academy could provide. Aristotle, returning to the palace of his childhood, not as a doctor's son, but as a master of wisdom, was given a secluded retreat, away from the court's intrigues. This was Mieza, the temple of the nymphs, a place of cool stone grottos and shaded walking paths where the sound of rushing water provided a constant, meditative backdrop. Here, the philosopher was presented with his most difficult specimen yet, a 13-year-old boy with one eye the color of the night sky and the other the color of the sea. Alexander was a child of fire and myth. His mother, Olympias, whispered in his ear that he was descended from Achilles, and that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself. He was high-strung, fiercely competitive, and possessed of a physical energy that seemed to vibrate even when he was standing still. To this boy, the world was not a collection of biological data points. It was a stage for heroic deeds. Historians still argue whether Aristotle and Alexander truly liked one another, or if their relationship was a polite collision of two incompatible worlds. But we know that for 3 years, in the cool shade of Mieza, the man who wanted to categorize the world sat across from the boy who wanted to conquer it. Aristotle did not try to turn Alexander into a mathematician or a mystic. Drawing on his own looking down philosophy, he taught the prince that a ruler must be a master of the particular. He taught him geography, not as abstract maps, but as the reality of rivers, mountains, and the logistics of supply lines. He taught him medicine, encouraging the boy to treat his own friends' ailments, grounding the future king in the visceral reality of human suffering. It is a charming and slightly humorous thought to imagine the reader trying to get the world's most restless teenager to sit still long enough to finish a scroll of Homer. Aristotle famously prepared a special edition of the Iliad for Alexander, the casket copy, which the prince would later keep under his pillow next to a dagger. To Aristotle, the Iliad was a study in character and the great-souled man. To Alexander, it was a manual for glory. Here, the divergence of the soul becomes vivid. Aristotle spoke of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies in the balance between extremes, that courage is the middle ground between cowardice and rashness. Alexander, however, had no interest in the middle. He was a creature of the edges, a soul that found its entelechy only in the furthest reaches of the unknown. He listened to his tutor's lectures on moderation, while likely dreaming of the horizon where the world ended. Yet Aristotle's influence was profound in ways that history often overlooks. He gave Alexander a framework of logic, a way to organize the chaos of a campaign. He instilled in him a scientific curiosity that would survive even the heat of battle. Years later, while marching through the dust of Persia and the jungles of India, Alexander would send back biological specimens, rare plants, strange animals, and reports on the tides to his old teacher in Athens. It was the world's first state-sponsored research expedition. In those quiet afternoons at Mieza, Aristotle was teaching the boy that the mind is the ultimate weapon, and that to rule men, one must first understand the nature of man. He used the tools of the academy to sharpen the edge of a conqueror, perhaps not realizing that the blade he was honing would eventually cut through the very fabric of the world he knew. The relationship between the philosopher and the prince was a bridge made of parchment and iron, spanning the gap between the world of thought and the world of action. In the quiet corridors of Mieza, the air was often thick with the scent of old ink and the sharper metallic tang of the training yard. Aristotle, now in his late 40s, found himself in a peculiar position. He was the intellectual architect of a boy who believed he was a god. Historians still argue whether Aristotle truly believed in the great-souled man, the megalopsychos, as a literal possibility, or if he was merely providing Alexander with a moral mirror, hoping the boy might see a version of himself that valued justice over raw power. The megalopsychos, in Aristotle's Ethics, is a man who deserves grand honors and knows he deserves them, moving through the world with a slow gait and a deep voice, never hurrying, never gossiping, unshakable as a mountain. It was an idealized version of the Macedonian spirit, but tempered with the restraint of the academy. While they sat together, Aristotle introduced the prince to the concept of the natural slave, a controversial and difficult part of his philosophy that reflects the prejudices of the age. He suggested to Alexander that Greeks were born for freedom and self-governance, while the barbarians of the East were, by their very nature, better suited for being ruled. It was a dangerous seed to plant in the mind of a conqueror. Yet, as the lessons progressed, a strange thing happened. Aristotle's looking down philosophy, his obsession with the specific, the local, and the biological, seemed to clash with Alexander's looking out ambition. Aristotle wanted the boy to understand the city-state, the polis, as the highest form of human community. He believed that a city should be small enough that all citizens could know one another by sight. Alexander, however, was already dreaming of a world without borders, a colossal, messy, universal empire that would make the polis look like a toy. The student was outgrowing the teacher's map before the ink was even dry. There is a soft, ironic humor in the thought of Aristotle trying to explain the golden mean of temperance to a teenager who would soon tame the wild horse Bucephalus by sheer force of will. Aristotle would speak of the virtue of gentleness, the middle ground between being a pushover and being a hothead. While Alexander's mother, Olympias, was busy sending her son snakes to sleep with and whispering that his father was a thunderbolt. It was a tug-of-war for the boy's soul. Aristotle gave him the Iliad, but Alexander gave the Iliad a terrifying new life. When Philip was away at war, the two of them would walk the stone paths of the Nymphaeum, and Aristotle would point to a specific leaf, explaining how its veins distributed nutrients, trying to ground the boy in the delicate mechanics of life. Alexander would look at the same leaf and ask how far the forests stretched toward the edge of the great ocean. One saw a system, the other saw a path. As the 3 years of formal tutoring drew to a close, the political climate of Macedonia shifted from simmering ambition to boiling point. Philip was ready to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, and Alexander was no longer a boy to be tutored, but a regent to be feared. Aristotle, ever the rationalist, saw that his work at Mieza was done. He had given the prince a library in his head. Now the prince intended to turn the world into a library of his own exploits. There was no dramatic falling out, but a gradual, respectful distancing. Aristotle received a generous parting gift. Some say a fortune in gold that allowed him to pursue his research for the rest of his life, and he prepared to return to the city that had once rejected him. He was leaving behind a student who would soon be known as the Great, but he was also leaving behind the wreckage of his own illusions. He had seen up close the spiritedness of the soul, the thumos, that Plato had described as a wild horse. He realized that logic alone could not tame a soul like Alexander's. As Aristotle traveled back toward Athens, he carried with him a deeper understanding of the human heart's capacity for both grand virtue and terrifying excess. He was going back to start his own school, the Lyceum, armed with the knowledge that philosophy must not only explain the world, but must also survive the men who run it. The reader was coming home, no longer as a student of the academy, but as a rival to its legacy, ready to build a sanctuary of reason in a world that was about to be set on fire by the very boy he had taught to read. The road back to Athens in 335 BC felt different beneath Aristotle's feet than the path he had walked as a youth. He was now a man of 50, seasoned by the salt of the Aegean and the cold steel of the Macedonian court. He arrived not as a student seeking a master, but as a master seeking a home. Athens, however, was a city of long memories and short tempers. The news of Philip's assassination and the sudden, violent ascension of Alexander had sent a tremor of fear through the Greek world. To many Athenians, Aristotle was no longer just a philosopher. He was the Macedonian, a man who had whispered in the ear of the boy king now knocking at their gates. But Aristotle was a creature of the middle ground, a man who believed that the mind must remain a neutral territory even when the soil is contested. He did not return to the academy, which was still under the leadership of Plato's heirs, clinging to the mathematical heavens. Instead, he sought out a place that reflected his own philosophy, a place of movement, of public life, and of the earth. He found it in a grove dedicated to Apollo Lykios, Apollo, the wolf god, located just outside the city walls to the east. This was the Lyceum. Unlike the secluded aristocratic garden of the academy, the Lyceum was a bustling public gymnasium, a place where soldiers trained, where old men gossiped, and where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and sun-baked dust. It was the perfect laboratory for a man who believed that philosophy should be lived in the open. Historians still argue whether the Lyceum was a formal school in the modern sense or a loose association of researchers. But the atmosphere Aristotle created was unmistakable. He did not build high walls to keep the world out. He built peripatoi, covered walkways or colonnades, where he could walk while he taught. This gave rise to the name of his followers, the Peripatetics, those who walk about. Imagine the scene at dawn. The philosopher, dressed in his dapper, well-maintained cloak, moving at a brisk pace through the dappled light of the grove, followed by a swarm of younger men. There was a method to this motion. Aristotle believed that the body and the mind were a single, integrated unit. If the blood was moving, the thoughts would follow. In the mornings, he held acrobatic lectures for his advanced students, tackling the deepest mysteries of logic, physics, and metaphysics. These were intense technical sessions where the reader would dissect the very structure of reality. In the afternoons, however, the doors, metaphorically speaking, were thrown open. He gave exoteric lectures to the general public, speaking on rhetoric, ethics, and politics. He was a philosopher of the people, a man who believed that wisdom was not a secret treasure to be hidden, but a public utility to be shared. The Lyceum quickly became a hive of unprecedented scientific activity. While the academy looked up at the stars and saw geometry, the Lyceum looked at the earth and saw a collection of data. Aristotle used his Macedonian wealth to fund a massive collaborative project. He sent his students out like a small army of observers. They collected the constitutions of 150 different Greek cities, comparing them to see which ones actually worked and why. They tracked the migration of birds, the breeding habits of bees, and the flowering times of plants. They were building the world's first encyclopedia, not from the comfort of an armchair, but from the grit of the field. There is a gentle humor in the local reaction to this. One can imagine the Athenian citizens watching these peripatetics with amusement as they carefully measured the length of a grasshopper's leg or argued passionately about the stomach of a cow. To the traditionalists, it must have seemed like a monumental waste of time. Why study the lowly things when you could be contemplating the absolute good? But Aristotle's answer was always the same. In every part of nature, there is something of the marvelous. Inside the Lyceum, the organization was as rigorous as the thinking. Aristotle established the first great library and a museum of natural history. There were maps, celestial globes, and jars containing specimens from the furthest reaches of Alexander's expanding empire. It was a factory of knowledge. Yet despite the industrial scale of the work, the spirit remained intimate. They ate together in a common mess, following rules of conduct that Aristotle himself had drafted, rules that emphasized moderation and intellectual friendship. This was the Aristotelian soul in practice, a soul that flourishes not by escaping the world, but by organizing it, understanding it, and finding its place within the great chain of being. But the wolf-god grove was not entirely safe. The political weather in Athens was turning cold. Alexander was now deep in the heart of Persia, and every victory he won made Aristotle's position in Athens more precarious. To the anti-Macedonian faction, led by the orator Demosthenes, the Lyceum was a nest of spies, a Macedonian outpost in the heart of democracy. Aristotle, the man of the golden mean, found himself caught between his loyalty to his former student and his love for the city of thought. He walked the peripatoi with a watchful eye, knowing that the looking down philosophy required a stable ground to stand on, and that ground was beginning to shake. He continued to teach, to write, and to categorize, building a fortress of logic that he hoped would withstand the coming storm. The reader had become a builder, and the Lyceum was the house where the modern mind was being framed, one careful observation at a time, while the shadows of the wolf god grew long in the evening sun. The transition from the open, bustling walkways of the Lyceum to the inner sanctum of Aristotle's private library was a move from the world of the many to the world of the one. Here, in the quiet heart of the school, the philosopher engaged in a different kind of struggle. The struggle to map the architecture of human thought itself. If Plato's greatest gift was the vision of what we should be, Aristotle's greatest gift was the manual for how we think. For years, historians have argued whether his works on logic, collectively known as the organon or the tool, were intended as a dry set of rules or as a liberation of the mind. To Aristotle, logic was not a branch of knowledge, but the skeleton upon which all knowledge hung. He looked at the chaotic, passionate debates of the Athenian assembly and saw a mess of fallacies, emotions, and half-truths. He wanted to give the human soul a compass that would work in any storm. He sat in the dim light of his study, surrounded by stacks of papyrus, and began to formulate the syllogism. The syllogism is a deceptively simple thing, yet it changed the world. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. To us, it seems obvious, like the air we breathe. But in the 4th century BC, this was a thunderclap. Aristotle was showing that truth could be reached through structure. If the premises are solid and the connection is valid, the conclusion is inevitable. It was a mathematical certainty applied to the messy business of language. He was stripping away the ornaments of the poets and the tricks of the lawyers to find the bones of an argument. This was the looking down method applied to the invisible world of ideas. He categorized every way a thing could be described: its substance, its quality, its quantity, its relation, creating the categories that would govern Western logic for 2 millennia. There is a quiet humor in the thought of Aristotle, trying to explain this to a frustrated student. No, you cannot argue that a cat is a dog because they both have 4 legs. That is a failure of the middle term. He was the first to realize that we don't just think, we follow paths of thought, and some of those paths lead to cliffs. But Aristotle was not a cold machine of logic. He knew that the soul was more than just a calculating engine. He turned his sharp, diagnostic gaze to the mystery of the first mover. While Plato saw a universe created by a divine craftsman who looked at the forms, Aristotle saw a universe in constant, beautiful motion, like a great clock that never winds down. He argued that there must be something at the very center, or the very edge, that starts all this motion without being moved itself. He called it the unmoved mover. It was not a personal God who listened to prayers or took sides in wars, but a pure, eternal intellect that spends its time doing the only thing worthy of its perfection, thinking about thinking. This was the Aristotelian soul at its most cosmic. We are most like the divine, he argued, not when we are acting or feeling, but when we are contemplating. When we solve a difficult proof or understand a deep truth, we are, for a fleeting moment, touching the same stillness that moves the stars. The tension between this cold cosmic logic and the warm, messy reality of human life was the bridge he walked every day. In the Lyceum, he would move from a lecture on the prior analytics to an observation of a pregnant goat. He saw no contradiction. The logic was the form, and the goat was the matter. He was teaching his students that to be a philosopher was to be a spectator of all time and all existence, but a spectator who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He was building a fortress of the mind that was meant to last. And as the reports from the East grew more fantastical, tales of Alexander crossing the Hindu Kush, of elephants that looked like mountains, of rivers that flowed with gold, Aristotle remained grounded in his grove. He knew that empires rise and fall like the tides of the lagoon, but a valid syllogism is eternal. The reader was now the systematizer, weaving a web of reason so strong that even the coming chaos of the Hellenistic age would not be able to tear it down. The sun would set on the Lyceum, and the students would go to their homes. But the categories Aristotle had carved into the mind would stay, waiting for the next morning, and every morning for the next 2,000 years. The rhythm of the Lyceum was a heartbeat of organized curiosity. As the years passed, Aristotle's looking down philosophy began to manifest in a way that would define the modern university, the division of knowledge into specialized fields. In the cool early mornings, before the heat of the Athenian sun became oppressive, Aristotle and his students would gather in the peripatos to discuss the most elusive of all topics, the nature of happiness. This was the birth of the Nicomachean ethics, named perhaps for his son, Nicomachus, or his father, a tribute to the lineage of the soul. For Plato, happiness was a transcendental state, a byproduct of the soul's reunion with the divine good. But for Aristotle, standing firmly on the earth, happiness, eudaimonia, was a practical activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. It was not a feeling you had, but something you did. It was a life lived well, like a flute player who plays with excellence, or a doctor who heals with skill. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's focus on habit was a reaction to the flighty, emotional nature of the Athenian public. But the pedagogical genius of it is undeniable. He taught his students that we are not born virtuous. We are born with the capacity for virtue, but we become brave by doing brave things, and we become just by doing just acts. It was a philosophy of the long game. Virtue, he insisted, was a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it withers. There is a gentle, dry humor in his observations of human character. He describes the boaster who claims qualities he doesn't have, and the mock-modest man who disclaims the qualities he does have, steering his students instead toward the great-souled man who walks the middle path. This focus on the golden mean was Aristotle's way of bringing the harmony of the Pythagorean stars down into the messy marketplace of human behavior. While the Academy focused on the ideal republic that might exist in the heavens, Aristotle's Lyceum became a laboratory of the real. He directed his students to collect and analyze the constitutions of 158 different Greek city-states. This was an immense, grinding labor of research, the ancient equivalent of a massive data mining project. They looked at everything: who had the right to vote, how the courts were managed, how the taxes were collected, and most importantly, why certain governments collapsed into tyranny while others flourished. Aristotle wasn't looking for a perfect static utopia like Plato. He was looking for a best possible government that took into account the stubborn, selfish reality of human nature. He concluded that the most stable society was one with a strong middle class, a polity that avoided the arrogance of the very rich and the desperation of the very poor. It was a vision of balance, grounded in the observation that whenever a system moves to an extreme, it invites its own destruction. But the Lyceum was more than a political think tank. It was the world's first true center for biological research. In the afternoon heat, the reader would transform back into the dissector. Aristotle's work on animals, the Historia Animalium, was a monumental achievement of the senses. He classified over 500 species, and his descriptions were so accurate that some were not confirmed by modern science until the invention of the microscope. He was fascinated by the parts of animals, the way a bird's wing is a variation of a human arm, or how the stomach of a ruminant is a complex machine for processing grass. He was looking for the why behind the what. Why does the deer have antlers, but the leopard has claws? Every creature, he argued, was designed for its own specific flourishing. The soul of the bee was to make honey and serve the hive. The soul of the human was to reason. This was the great chain of being, a hierarchy of life where everything had a place and a purpose. There is a scholarly debate about the source of his specimens. While many came from the local Athenian markets or his own walks in the countryside, a significant portion likely arrived in crates from the east, sent by Alexander's surveyors. Imagine the excitement in the Lyceum when a shipment arrived containing the skin of a tiger or the strange pressed leaves of a plant from the Indus Valley. For a man who believed that all men by nature desire to know, these were treasures far more valuable than the gold Alexander was plundering. Yet even as he catalogued the world, Aristotle remained a man of deep, quiet affection. He lived with a woman named Herpilis after the death of his first wife, and his will, which has survived the centuries, reveals a man of profound decency, making careful provision for her comfort and the manumission of his slaves. He was a philosopher who practiced the friendship he preached. As the evening shadows lengthened over the wolf god's grove, the Lyceum felt like a sanctuary of clarity in an increasingly chaotic world. Aristotle had created a system where every fact had a shelf and every question had a method. He had replaced the shadows of the cave with the light of observation. But the world outside was not interested in the golden mean. Alexander's empire was stretching toward breaking point, and the anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens was a slow-burning fire, waiting for a spark. Aristotle, the Macedonian who taught the wolf, knew that his time in the grove was a borrowed gift. He continued to write, his stylus moving across the papyrus with the steady rhythmic pace of a man who knows that while life is short, the system is long. The reader had become the architect of reality, building a house of reason that would eventually house the mind of the entire Western world, even if the man himself was about to be cast back into the storm. The passage of time in the Lyceum was marked not by the tolling of bells, but by the steady accumulation of knowledge, a slow sedimentation of truth that felt as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Aristotle was now a man of 60, his face etched with the fine lines of a lifetime of looking at scrolls, looking at stars, looking into the eyes of his students. He had reached that stage of intellectual mastery where the world no longer seems like a collection of separate objects, but a single, vast, interlocking system. In the quiet hours before the students arrived, he often sat in the library, the reader finally pausing to reflect on the nature of the first philosophy, what we now call metaphysics. If his work on animals was the looking down, and his logic was the tool, then his metaphysics was the attempt to find the very ground upon which everything stands. He asked the most difficult question of all: what does it mean for something to be? Historians and philosophers still argue whether Aristotle's metaphysics was ever meant to be a single book, or if it was a collection of high-level lecture notes stitched together by his later followers. The text is jagged, difficult, and brilliant, like a mountain path that requires both hands to climb. In these pages, he moved beyond the Platonic forms to explore the relationship between potentiality and actuality. To Aristotle, everything in the universe is in a state of becoming. An acorn is a potential oak tree. A block of marble is a potential statue. A child is a potential sage. The soul is the force that pushes the potential into the actual. This was a vision of a dynamic, striving universe. It was no longer a world of static shadows, but a world of energy and purpose, a telos. Every heartbeat, every falling stone, every circling planet was part of a grand cosmic desire to reach its own state of perfection. This led him to his famous four causes, the diagnostic toolkit he used to explain the existence of anything in the world. Imagine Aristotle standing before a bronze statue in the Lyceum, his students gathered around him. To truly know this statue, he argued, you must understand four things. First, the material cause. What is it made of? In this case, bronze. Second, the formal cause. What is its shape or essence? The figure of a man. Third, the efficient cause. Who or what brought it into being? The sculptor's hands and tools. And finally, the final cause. What is its purpose? To honor a god or beautify the city. To Aristotle, the final cause, the purpose, was the most important. He believed that nature does nothing in vain. The heavy coat of the mountain goat exists for the cold. The sharp teeth of the lion exist for the hunt. Even the human soul has a final cause, to exercise reason in the pursuit of a flourishing life. This was a comforting, ordered world where nothing was an accident and everything had a why. There is a subtle, scholarly humor in how Aristotle applied this to himself. He saw his own life as a movement toward his own final cause, the life of pure contemplation. In the 10th book of his Ethics, he suggests that while a political activity and moral virtue are noble, the highest form of human existence is the life of the mind. When we think about the eternal laws of the universe, we are participating in the only activity that is its own reward. We are, for a moment, like the unmoved mover, self-sufficient and at peace. This was the Aristotelian lullaby, the belief that beneath the chaos of politics and the decay of the body, there is a logical, beautiful, and purposeful structure that we can understand if we only have the patience to look. But the efficient cause of his own safety was beginning to fail. Far to the east, the news from Alexander's camp had taken a darker turn. The prince who had slept with the Iliad under his pillow had become a great king, adopting Persian dress and demanding the ritual of proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself before the monarch. Aristotle's own nephew, Callisthenes, who had gone with the expedition as a historian, refused to bow. He reminded Alexander that Greeks only bow to gods. For this act of philosophical integrity, Callisthenes was arrested, tortured, and executed. When the news reached the Lyceum, the silence must have been devastating. The boy Aristotle had taught to be a great-souled man had become a tyrant. The golden mean had been shattered by the weight of an empire. This tragedy was a reminder that even the most perfect system of logic cannot account for the volatility of the human heart. Aristotle continued to teach, but the spark of optimism that had fueled the early days of the Lyceum was lightly tempered by a deep, private grief. He realized that the looking down philosophy had to include the darkness as well as the light. He turned his attention to the study of tragedy, writing the Poetics, where he explored how art can purge the soul of pity and fear through catharsis. He was looking for a way to heal the wounds that politics and power inflicted on the human spirit. As the evening wind rustled the leaves of the wolf-god grove, Aristotle sat among his scrolls, a man who had mapped the earth and the heavens, only to find that the most unmappable territory was the person he had helped to shape. The reader was now a man of sorrows, but his commitment to the truth remained unshaken. He knew that the system he had built, the categories, the syllogisms, the four causes, would outlast the empire of his student. He watched the shadows grow long, finding a strange, logical peace in the knowledge that even decline and death are part of the natural order, a necessary movement from the actual back into the potential. The night was coming, but the architect of reality had already drawn the blueprints for a world that would never truly be in the dark again. The year is 323 BC, and a hot, dry wind blows through the streets of Athens, carrying with it a rumor that feels like the end of an era. The news has arrived from Babylon. Alexander is dead. The boy king who had swallowed the world has been swallowed by a fever at the age of 32. In an instant, the invisible shield that had protected the Lyceum for 12 years vanishes. For Aristotle, the death of his former student is not just a personal loss or a historical pivot. It is a direct threat to his life. Athens, long suppressed by Macedonian might, erupts in a fever of liberation. The anti-Macedonian faction, led by the fiery orator Demosthenes, finally sees its chance. To the angry crowds in the agora, the philosopher in the wolf-god grove is no longer a seeker of truth. He is a symbol of the occupier. He is the man who taught the tyrant. He is a foreigner who has overstayed his welcome. The charges brought against him are a chilling echo of the past. He is accused of a sebeia, impiety. The pretext is a poem he wrote years ago for his friend Hermias, which the prosecutors claim treats a mortal man as a god. It is a thin, legalistic mask for a purely political vendetta. Aristotle, the master of logic, sees the syllogism of his own fate being written. Athens kills philosophers who challenge its pride. Aristotle is a philosopher who challenges its pride. Therefore, but Aristotle is not Socrates. He does not believe that the soul's integrity requires it to stay and drink the hemlock provided by a vengeful mob. He remembers the cold cup in the hand of his teacher's teacher. He famously remarks that he will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. In this moment, the Aristotelian soul chooses the path of practical wisdom, phronesis. He realizes that his final cause is not to be a martyr, but to preserve the library of human knowledge he has spent a lifetime building. The evacuation of the Lyceum is a quiet, desperate labor. Imagine the students and the aging philosopher working by the light of flickering lamps, carefully packing thousands of papyrus scrolls into wooden chests. These are not just books. They are the genetic code of Western thought, the notes on biology, the logic, the ethics, the physics. They are the map of the world. If these scrolls are burned, the world will forget itself for 1,000 years. Aristotle watches the chests being loaded onto carts, his thin legs trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He is 62 years old, and he is being cast out of the city he has loved for most of his life. He looks back at the Lyceum one last time, the peripatoi where he walked, the gardens where he measured the earth, and he turns away. He flees to Chalcis on the island of Euboea, to a house that had belonged to his mother. It is a place of refuge, but it is also a place of exile. The air here is different. It lacks the electric intellectual hum of Athens. He sits on a balcony overlooking the Euripus Strait, watching the famous Euripus phenomenon, a strange, rhythmic reversal of the tides that occurs several times a day. Legend has it that he spent his final months trying to solve the logic of this tide, frustrated that even at the end, nature held secrets he could not categorize. But his health is failing. A chronic stomach ailment, perhaps exacerbated by the stress of his flight, is claiming his strength. The man who taught that the soul is the actuality of the body now feels that body becoming heavy, uncooperative matter. In these final days, Aristotle performs one last act of looking down philosophy. He dictates his will. This document, preserved for us, is one of the most moving windows into the heart of the ancient world. He does not speak of the unmoved mover or the golden mean. Instead, he worries about the people in his life. He makes sure Herpyllis, the woman who stayed with him after Pythias died, is provided for with a house and enough money to live in dignity. He arranges for the care of his children. He gives instructions for the manumission of several of his slaves, ensuring they are not sold but given their freedom. He even asks that the bones of his first wife, Pythias, be moved and buried next to him, as she had requested. It is the will of a man who believed that the highest life is one of reason, but that reason is hollow without the warmth of human loyalty. He dies in 322 BC, just a year after Alexander. The reader falls silent. The man who had organized the universe into categories finally steps into the one category He could not analyze the void. Back in Athens, the Lyceum survives under his hand-picked successor, Theophrastus. But the great library, the thousands of scrolls, embarks on a journey that would make for a thriller. They are hidden in a cellar in Asia Minor to keep them out of the hands of book-collecting kings, rotting in the damp for 2 centuries before being rediscovered and brought to Rome. For a long time, the world almost forgot the looking-down philosopher, favoring the more mystical, soaring Plato. But Aristotle's work was a sleeper cell of reason, waiting for its moment to wake up and build the modern world. As the sun sets over the Strait of Chalcis, the light reflects off the water in a way that suggests both the up and the down. Plato and Aristotle, the 2 visions of the soul, remain the 2 lungs of human thought. We breathe with both. We need the Platonic dream of the ideal to give us hope, to make us reach for the stars, to remind us that we are more than our chemistry. And we need the Aristotelian grounding in the real to give us tools, to make us look at the facts, to remind us that we have a responsibility to live well in the world we actually inhabit. They are the 2 hands of the same spirit. Close your eyes now and let the sounds of the ancient world fade. The rustle of the papyrus, the slap of sandals on stone, the murmur of the olive grove, they are all part of the long, quiet lullaby of history. You are part of this conversation too. Every time you ask why, every time you seek a balance, every time you look at a flower and wonder at its design, you are walking the paths of the Academy and the Lyceum. The questions remain, but the urgency has dissolved into the soft, velvet dark. The 2 masters have finished their walk. The library is closed for the night. The unmoved mover is at rest, and so can you be. The world is an ordered, beautiful place, and you have found your place within it. The death of Aristotle did not mean the death of his vision, but it did begin a long, strange period of hibernation for the Aristotelian soul. While Plato's Academy continued to flourish in Athens, becoming more skeptical and eventually more mystical, the Lyceum faced the harsh realities of a world without its architect. Theophrastus, Aristotle's loyal friend and the world's first systematic botanist, took the lead, but he lacked the political protection that Aristotle had once enjoyed through his Macedonian ties. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Lyceum was due to the rising tide of Stoicism and Epicureanism, philosophies that offered more immediate emotional comfort in a crumbling world, or if the sheer technical difficulty of Aristotle's looking-down method was simply too much for a city in mourning for its lost power. Regardless, the physical library of the Lyceum, that legendary mountain of papyrus, was about to undergo a journey as perilous as any odyssey. According to ancient accounts, the library was left to Neleus of Sepsis, a student who took the scrolls back to his home in Asia Minor. When the local kings began aggressively seizing books to fill their own libraries, Neleus's heirs did something desperate. They buried the works of Aristotle in a trench. Imagine these scrolls, the metaphysics, the ethics, the physics, lying in the damp, dark earth, hidden in a cellar or a cave, being chewed by worms and softened by mold. For nearly 200 years, while the Roman Republic was rising and the Mediterranean was being reshaped, the most systematic mind in history was literally underground. This explains why the world for a long time only knew Platonic philosophy. Plato's dialogues were beautiful, widely copied, and always available. Aristotle's technical treatises were a forgotten secret, rotting in the dirt. It wasn't until around 80 BC that a wealthy book collector named Apellicon of Deos rediscovered the remains of the library and brought them back to Athens. They were eventually seized by the Roman general Sulla and taken to Rome, where a scholar named Andronicus of Rhodes finally set about the monumental task of editing them. This is a crucial historical truth. The Aristotle we read today is the version compiled by Andronicus. He was the one who decided which scrolls belonged together, giving us the titles we recognize. He placed the books on first philosophy, after the books on physics, and so they became known as ta metaphysica, literally, the things after the physics, which is where we get our word metaphysics. Without this Roman editor, the looking down vision might have been lost to the wind. This rediscovery sparked a revolution in the Roman soul. The Romans were practical people, engineers, lawyers, and soldiers. They found Plato a bit too airy, too focused on the up, but they found in the recovered Aristotle a mind they could use. They loved his logic, his categories, and his focus on habit and character. But even as Aristotle was being resurrected in Rome, the spiritual landscape of the world was shifting. A new religion was rising from the East, one that spoke of a soul that was a traveler in a fallen world, a vision that felt much closer to Plato's cave than to Aristotle's biology. For the next millennium, the Western mind would find itself pulled between these two poles once again, trying to reconcile the God of the Bible with the reason of the Greeks. In the monasteries of Europe and the vibrant houses of wisdom in Baghdad, the debate continued in the dark. The Platonic soul became the soul of the saint, longing for the beatific vision and the celestial forms. The Aristotelian soul became the soul of the scholar, trying to understand how the rain falls, how the heart beats, and how we can use logic to prove the existence of the divine. Scholars in the Islamic world, like Avicenna and Averroes, became the true guardians of the looking down method, translating and commenting on Aristotle with such devotion that he became known simply as the philosopher. They realized, as Aristotle did, that you don't have to choose between the heavens and the earth, that the study of the particular is the only way to reach the universal. As the night deepens, consider the irony of these two men. Plato, the aristocrat who wanted to transcend the world, left behind a legacy that built the inner life of the spirit. Aristotle, the doctor's son who wanted to categorize the world, left behind a legacy that built the outer life of science and law. Most of us spend our lives trying to be both. We have our Platonic moments of longing for something perfect, and our Aristotelian moments of needing to organize the chaos of our day. We are the prisoners in the cave, but we are also the biologists counting the shadows. The air in your room is still, much like the air in that buried library in sepsis, holding the potential for 1,000 truths. You can rest now, knowing that the looking down and the looking up are not a conflict, but a conversation. The master and the student are still walking together, their sandals silent on the stone, their hands gesturing toward the stars and the ground. The world is a place of order, even in the dark. The reader has finished his work, and the visionary has seen his light. You are safe in the middle ground, in the golden mean between the day and the dream. The slow, steady current of the Middle Ages brought the two visions of the soul into a grand, stone-hewn laboratory, the medieval university. By the 13th century, the looking-down philosopher had returned to the West with a force that unsettled the very foundations of the Church. For centuries, Plato's shadow had reigned supreme, his light-filled mysticism blending perfectly with the Christian longing for a world beyond the veil. But now, through the translations flowing from Islamic Spain, Aristotle was back, and he brought with him a terrifyingly logical world that didn't seem to need a miracle to function. This sparked the greatest intellectual crisis of the era. Historians still argue whether the Church's initial ban on Aristotle's natural philosophy in Paris was an act of fear or a necessary pause to prevent reason from swallowing faith whole. Into this tension stepped a man who would become the ultimate bridge builder, Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a mountain of a man, quiet and methodical, nicknamed the dumb ox by his classmates because he moved and spoke with such deliberate slowness. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind that functioned like an Aristotelian forge. He looked at the up of the theologians and the down of the scientists and realized they were looking at the same mountain from different sides. He argued that grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. In his massive Summa Theologica, Aquinas used Aristotle's logic to prove that the human soul is both the form of the body, as Aristotle said, and a spiritual substance that survives death, as Plato hinted. He made it holy to be a scientist. He suggested that by studying the anatomy of a bee or the motion of the tides, one was actually reading the thoughts of God. It was a second golden age for the reader, where the library and the cathedral finally shook hands. Yet, there is a gentle humor in how this reconciliation worked on the ground. Imagine a medieval monk trained to look only toward heaven, suddenly being told by his superiors that he must spend his afternoons classifying different types of moss or debating the efficient cause of a thunderbolt. The Aristotelian method turned the monasteries into the first true laboratories. They began to realize that if the world was a logical system, then it could be understood, predicted, and perhaps even improved. This was the seed of the Renaissance. The looking down gaze was teaching humanity that the earth was not a place of exile to be endured, but a garden of wonders to be explored. The soul was not just a prisoner in a cage, it was a pilot in a ship, and it was time to learn how the ship was built. However, the Aristotelian soul soon found itself facing a new kind of challenge. As the 14th century turned into the 15th, a group of thinkers known as the humanists began to feel that the ox's logic had become too cold, too dry, and too detached from human emotion. They longed for the poetry of Plato once again. In Florence, under the patronage of the Medici, a new Platonic academy was founded, led by Marsilio Ficino. They didn't want syllogisms, they wanted beauty. They didn't want categories, they wanted the divine frenzy. They looked back at the up gesture and saw the fire of the soul's desire. This was the birth of the Renaissance man, a creature who tried to balance the technical mastery of the Aristotelian world with the artistic longing of the Platonic one. This brings us to a beautiful scholarly debate about the nature of art during this time. Did the great painters of the Renaissance favor one vision over the other? Look at the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci. In one page, he is a pure Aristotelian, dissecting a human heart with clinical, terrifying accuracy, counting the valves and tracing the flow of the blood, the ultimate looking down. On the next page, he is a Platonist, searching for the divine proportion in the human face, trying to capture a smile that seems to belong to another world entirely. He was the living embodiment of the struggle between the two masters. He understood that to paint a human soul, you must first know how the muscles of the face move, but you must also know what it feels like to long for the stars. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that your own mind is a direct descendant of this grand reconciliation. You live in a world built by Aristotle's down, a world of medicine, technology, and legal systems. But you dream in a world shaped by Plato's up, a world of ideals, of love that feels eternal, and of a sense that you are meant for more than just survival. The two visions are not enemies. They are the left and right hands of your own consciousness. One helps you navigate the room you are in, while the other reminds you of the horizon beyond the window. The night is a bridge between these two states. In sleep, you let go of the Aristotelian categories of the day. You stop being a citizen, a worker, or a logical thinker. You descend into the Platonic realm of the dream, where time is fluid, and the forms of your life take on strange, poetic shapes. But when you wake, you will reach for the Aristotelian grounding of the morning, the weight of the blanket, the taste of the air, the logic of the routine. You are the golden mean in person. The dumb ox and the swan are both resting now, and the great library of history is quiet. The world is a system that works, and a vision that inspires. Sleep now in the perfect balance of the two. The turning of the centuries eventually brought the world to a room in the Vatican, where the paint was still wet and the air smelled of plaster and linseed oil. It is here, between 1509 and 1511, that the high Renaissance painter Raphael gave us the visual summary of everything we have discussed. In his masterpiece, The School of Athens, he gathered the greatest minds of antiquity into a single, majestic hall that feels like a cathedral of thought. At the very center of the composition, framed by a series of soaring arches that lead the eye towards the infinite, stand the two giants. Plato, on the left, is an elderly man with the face of Leonardo da Vinci, carrying his book, the Timaeus, his hand pointing resolutely to the sky. Aristotle, on the right, is a man in the prime of his life, carrying his ethics, his hand extended palm down toward the earth. This single image did more to cement the up and down distinction than 1,000 years of dusty scrolls. Historians still argue whether Raphael intended this as a scene of conflict or a scene of perfect collaboration. But the architecture of the room suggests the latter. They are the two pillars holding up the roof of human civilization. If you look closely at the figures surrounding them, you see the Aristotelian soul in action. To the side, Euclid, or perhaps Archimedes, crouches on the floor with a compass, drawing a geometric proof on a slate, while a group of students leans in with intense, focused curiosity. This is the looking down at its most practical, the belief that the secrets of the universe are written in the language of measurement. Nearby, Diogenes the Cynic sprawls on the steps, a man who famously told Alexander the Great to move out of his sunlight, reminding us that the soul's freedom often begins with the rejection of material clutter. The painting is a frozen symposium, a moment where the reader and the visionary coexist in a state of mutual respect. It was a visual promise to the world. We can have both the dream and the data. We can reach for the heavens without losing our footing on the stone. However, as the Renaissance gave way to the scientific revolution, the Aristotelian soul faced its most brutal test. New voices began to argue that we had become too dependent on the reader's old books and not enough on the dissector's new tools. Francis Bacon, an English lawyer with a mind as sharp as a scalpel, argued that Aristotle's logic was a hindrance to discovery because it focused on arguing about words rather than observing things. He wanted a new organon, a new tool that would use induction, gathering facts to find a rule rather than deduction, using a rule to find a fact. This was Aristotle's own method being turned against his followers. Bacon famously joked that the medieval scholastics were like spiders, spinning beautiful webs of logic out of their own bodies, but producing no fruit for the relief of man's estate. He wanted us to be like bees, gathering nectar from the real world and transforming it into the honey of technology. This shift was a radical deepening of the looking down gaze. The invention of the telescope and the microscope showed us that the particulars were even smaller and more complex than Aristotle could have ever imagined. Galileo looked at the moon and saw not a perfect celestial sphere, but a rugged, cratered world made of the same messy stuff as the earth. This was a triumph for the Aristotelian focus on observation, but it was a death blow to the Aristotelian belief that the heavens were made of a different, purer substance. The universe was becoming a single, vast machine, governed by the same laws of physics from the top to the bottom. The up and down were merging into a single, terrifyingly large here. There is a subtle humor in the reaction of the traditionalists to these new sights. Some professors at the time refused to even look through Galileo's telescope, fearing that the illusions of the glass would contradict the truth of the books. They were the new prisoners in the cave, clinging to the shadows of the old texts, because the light of the new reality was too blinding. But the Aristotelian soul is, at its heart, a soul of courage. It is the soul that says, I will trust what I see, even if it breaks my heart. The reader had to learn to read a new book, the book of nature, written in the alphabet of mathematics. As the night air cools your room, think about how this tension between the old truth and the new sight lives within you. We all have moments where we cling to what we were told, the comfortable shadows of our past, and moments where we must be brave enough to look through the telescope and see the world as it truly is. We are all scientists of our own lives, collecting data, making observations, and trying to find the golden mean between tradition and discovery. The School of Athens is never really closed. The arches of that hall stretch into your own mind. You are the one holding the compass. You are the one looking at the stars. The up gesture of Plato reminds you to hope, to imagine a better version of yourself, to believe in the form of the good. The down gesture of Aristotle reminds you to be present, to count your blessings, to do the work of the day with excellence and habit. Sleep now, in the grand cathedral of human thought, where the paint never dries and the conversation never ends. The light of the arches is fading into the soft glow of the moon, and the giants are finally lowering their hands to rest. As the modern age began to gather speed, the looking down and looking up philosophies found themselves in a world that was becoming increasingly preoccupied with the mechanics of the machine. The 17th and 18th centuries were a time of blind spots of genius, a period where the brightest minds in history struggled to reconcile their ancient maps of the soul with the new raw data of a revolutionary world. Even Aristotle, the master of observation, had his limits, limits shaped by the horizon of his own time. He had believed that the earth was the unmoving center of the cosmos, and that certain people were naturally suited for servitude. Historians still argue whether these errors were failures of his method, or simply the inevitable gravity of the era he lived in. But the Aristotelian soul is nothing if not resilient. It teaches us that truth is a process of correction, not a static monument. As the Enlightenment dawned, thinkers like Immanuel Kant tried to perform the ultimate looking around, attempting to define the very boundaries of what a human mind can actually know. In the quiet, candlelit libraries of Europe, a new kind of Section 22 was being written, a chapter of human vulnerability. We began to realize that our visions of the soul were often mirrors of our own cultural anxieties. When Plato looked up at the perfect forms, was he seeking a truth beyond time, or was he merely seeking an escape from the bloody collapse of Athenian democracy? When Aristotle looked down at the hierarchy of nature, was he discovering an eternal order, or was he justifying the rigid social structures of the Macedonian Empire? These questions do not diminish their greatness. They make them our kin. They remind us that philosophy is not a divine dictation, but a human struggle, whispered through the dark by people who were just as tired, just as hopeful, and just as flawed as we are. There is a soft, historical humor in the way the golden mean was tested during this era. Imagine the dapper French philosophers of the 1700s, dressed in their silk waistcoats and powdered wigs, trying to apply Aristotle's rules of logic to the chaotic, emotional explosion of the French Revolution. They wanted the polity, the stable middle-class government Aristotle praised, but they found themselves caught in a storm of extremes that no syllogism could contain. They learned, as Plato had in Sicily, that the philosopher king is a difficult role to cast when the audience is screaming for bread. The down gesture of Aristotle became a plea for stability, while the up gesture of Plato became a radical call for a completely new world. We see this tension even today, the desire to fix what we have versus the desire to tear it all down and start from a perfect blueprint. As you breathe in the cool night air, let yourself feel the relief of not having to have all the answers. The blind spots of the past are a permission slip for our own uncertainties. We don't have to be perfect readers or perfect visionaries. We are allowed to be works in progress. The Aristotelian soul is not a finished statue. It is the activity of a life trying to find its balance. You are allowed to be wrong, as long as you are willing to look again. You are allowed to be tired, as long as you remember that the unmoved mover within you, your own capacity for thought, is still there, waiting for the morning. The history of the soul is a long, winding path through a forest of mirrors. Sometimes we see the stars, and sometimes we see the dirt. Both are real. Both are necessary. The Section 22 of your own life is being written right now, in the quiet beat of your heart and the slow drift of your thoughts towards sleep. You are the heir to a conversation that has survived wars, fires, and the burial of libraries. You are the point where the up and the down meet. The lamps are being extinguished in the great salon of history. The bewigged thinkers and the white-bearded sages are all leaning back in their chairs, their voices dropping to a murmur. They have said their piece, and now it is your turn to find the golden mean between the day's effort and the night's rest. The world is large, the history is deep, and your soul is a part of it all. A small, bright point of light in the vast, logical, and beautiful darkness. Sleep now, and let the reader and the visionary watch over your dreams. The year 323 BC did not merely bring the death of a king in Babylon. It brought a sudden, sharp winter to the political climate of Athens. When the news of Alexander's passing reached the city, the air in the Lyceum grew cold with the realization that the Macedonian was no longer under the protection of the world breaker. History tells us that the anti-Macedonian faction rose like a tide that had been held back by a crumbling levee. Aristotle, a man who had spent his life meticulously categorizing the world, now found himself categorized by others as a traitor and a spy. It is a profound historical truth that the very logic he championed, the idea that a man is defined by his associations, was being used to weave a noose around his neck. He watched the city he had called home for decades turn into a landscape of pointing fingers. The world breaker had died, and the fragments of his empire were sharp enough to draw blood from any who had been close to him. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's decision to flee was an act of cowardice or the ultimate expression of his practical wisdom. Phronesis. To the Athenians, a man of honor stayed to face his accusers, just as Socrates had done 76 years earlier. But Aristotle, looking at the same city, saw a different syllogism. He saw a city that had lost its balance, moving from the golden mean of justice to the extreme of vengeful passion. He famously remarked to his friends that he would not stay to see Athens sin twice against philosophy. This was not a flight of fear, but a flight of preservation. He was protecting the library of the soul that he carried in his head and in the thousands of scrolls in his study. He knew that if he stayed, the mob would not just kill a man, they would burn a world of data. There is a subtle, dry humor in imagining the logistics of this escape. Aristotle, a man of dapper habits and orderly mind, had to organize a midnight evacuation of a research facility. Imagine the crates of sea urchins, the jars of preserved specimens, and the mountains of papyrus being loaded onto carts in the dead of night. It was the world's first brain drain. He was taking the looking down method and moving it across the water to Chalcis, on the island of Euboea. He arrived at his mother's ancestral home, a quiet house overlooking the Euripus Strait, where the water flows back and forth in a strange, restless rhythm. It was a fitting place for a man whose life had been a constant movement between the north and the south, between the palace and the grove, between the teacher and the king. But the world breaker's death had left a vacuum that no logic could fill. In the months that followed, Aristotle's own body began to fail him, as if the efficient cause of his vitality was linked to the stability of the world he had mapped. He suffered from a chronic stomach ailment, a matter that his form could no longer master. Even in his physical decline, he remained a student of the particular. He spent his final days watching the tides of the Euripus, trying to understand why the water changed direction 7 times a day. He was looking for the why until the very end. The man who had explained the stars was humbled by a narrow strip of water, a reminder that the universe always keeps a few secrets for itself, just to keep the philosopher honest. As you drift towards sleep, consider the vulnerability of the great minds. They were not statues of marble. They were people who got cold, who got tired, and who had to pack their bags and run when the world turned dark. The Aristotelian soul is not a soul of invincibility, but a soul of adaptation. It is the soul that knows when to stand and when to move, when to speak and when to listen to the silence of the tides. You are safe now in your own Khalsis, a place of refuge where the noise of the world breaker cannot reach you. The night is a tide that flows in one direction only, toward rest. The political storms of 323 BC have long since settled into the dust of history books, but the quiet courage of the man who chose to save the books instead of the ego remains. You don't have to fight every battle tonight. You are allowed to protect your peace, to pack away the worries of the day, and to retreat to the quiet house of your own mind. The reader is closing his last scroll. The ink is dry, and the rhythm of the water outside the window is a slow, steady lullaby. Sleep now. In the middle ground, between the world's chaos and the soul's order, the flight from Athens was not a frantic sprint, but a measured, melancholy withdrawal, the physical manifestation of a philosopher choosing to protect the form of his life's work from the decaying matter of a city's rage. Aristotle settled in Chalcis, his mother's birthplace on the island of Euboea, a place where the air was sharper and the sea more turbulent than the sheltered bays of Attica. He moved into a house that smelled of cedar and old stone, overlooking the Euripus Strait. Here, the reader found himself in a strange, final confrontation with the limits of human reason. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's obsession with the Euripus tide, a phenomenon where the water reverses its flow up to 14 times a day, was a symptom of his scientific mind seeking order in chaos, or a symbolic struggle with a world that no longer made sense after Alexander's death. Legend, perhaps unkindly, suggests he was so frustrated by his inability to find a final cause for the tide that he threw himself into the water. But the historical truth is far more human and far more moving. He was simply a man whose stomach, long troubled by the stresses of a life at the center of the storm, was finally giving way. In this quiet exile, the Aristotelian soul performed its most graceful act of looking down. Knowing that his own efficient cause, his health, was failing, Aristotle turned his attention to his legacy. He did not write a grand mystical treatise on the afterlife, as Plato might have done. Instead, he wrote his will. This document is a masterpiece of the golden mean, a perfect balance of legal precision and deep personal tenderness. He made careful arrangements for her Pillis, the woman who had shared his life and bed since the death of his wife Pythias. He ensured she would have a house, a steady income, and the right to choose her own future, either staying in his house or marrying again. He spoke of his children with a father's quiet anxiety, and then, in a gesture that would have shocked the aristocratic circles of his youth, he turned to his slaves. He did not treat them as animate tools, as he once had in his colder theoretical writings. He ordered that many of them be freed upon his death, and that none of them be sold. In the face of his own end, the philosopher's practice had finally surpassed his own theory. There is a soft, bittersweet humor in imagining the local people of Chalcis watching the most famous scientist in the world spend his last days staring at the water. To them, he was just a dapper, frail old man with a slight lisp, perhaps a bit too obsessed with the way the sea moved. They did not know that the man on the balcony was holding the blueprints for the next 2,000 years of human thought. He was the guardian of a library that was currently being created and hidden, a collection of thoughts that would eventually build the universities of Europe and the laboratories of the modern age. He was the unmoved mover of his own small world, keeping his mind clear even as his body became heavy and cold. As the sun sets over the Strait of Chalcis, the light catches the water in a way that makes the constant shifting of the current look like a living thing. Aristotle, the man who believed that all men by nature desire to know, was coming to terms with the ultimate unknown. He was moving from the actual of his lived life back into the potential of history. He had mapped the soul, categorized the animals, and defined the virtues. And now he was simply a human being, tired and ready for the long silence. He was leaving the cave of the world, not by escaping to the stars, but by accepting his place in the soil. The night in Chalcis is deep and quiet, the only sound the rhythmic sloshing of the tide against the rocks below. You are safe in your own refuge, far from the second sin of the city. The political anger and the academic rivalries of 322 BC have long since dissolved into the salt air, leaving behind only the steady, logical heartbeat of a life lived well. You don't have to solve the mystery of the tides tonight. You don't have to write your legacy or defend your choices. You can simply be like the water, moving in the direction you are pulled, trusting that the order of the universe is large enough to hold you. The reader has laid down his stylus. The lamp is low, and the shadows in the room are no longer prisoners, but simply the soft, dark companions of a mind at peace. The Aristotelian soul has found its golden mean between the effort of the day and the stillness of the night. Sleep now while the tides of history continue their restless dance outside your window. The house is secure, the will is written, and the truth is safe. The final will of Aristotle, preserved for us through the long centuries by the biographer Diogenes Laertius, is more than a legal document. It is a map of a man's heart at the moment it stops seeking the universal and settles into the deeply personal. In the quiet of his house in Chalcis, as the autumn of 322 BC turned the leaves of the Euboean oaks to gold, the reader turned his diagnostic gaze inward. He knew that his efficient cause, his life force, was ebbing away. A man who had spent decades defining the great-souled man and the unmoved mover might have been expected to leave a grand testament of metaphysical defiance. Instead, Aristotle wrote about the comfort of a woman, the future of his children, and the bones of his wife. Historians still argue whether his meticulous care for her pillis was a sign of a revolutionary view of women, or simply the behavior of a man who practiced the friendship he preached in his ethics. He stated with clear-eyed tenderness that she should be provided for in a manner worthy of me, ensuring she had the choice of houses and a servant to help her. It was a philosophy of the hearth, a final looking down that saw the dignity in domestic stability. In these final hours, the dapper philosopher, who had once worn rings and kept his hair fashionably short, was reduced to the essential. He looked at his slaves not as animate tools for the production of wealth, but as individuals with names and histories, He ordered that none of his servants who had served him well should be sold, and that several, including Philon and Olympian, should be given their freedom. It was a quiet, practical correction to the harsher theories of his youth. The golden mean was no longer a geometric point on a scale. It was a softening of the heart. He even remembered his first wife, Pythias, who had died years before. He requested that her bones be taken up and buried next to his, wherever they may bury me, for such was her wish. In the face of the great, cold logic of the universe, Aristotle chose the logos of love and loyalty. It was the ultimate Aristotelian lullaby, the belief that a life is not a collection of arguments, but a fabric of relationships. The scholarly debate regarding his death often lingers on the mystery of his stomach ailment. Some ancient gossips whispered of poison, a recurring theme in the paranoid politics of the era, while modern medical historians suggest a chronic ulcer or cancer, exacerbated by the relentless pace of his work and the trauma of exile. Regardless of the biology, the ending was peaceful. He did not die in a public square or a prison cell, but in the shelter of a family home, surrounded by the scrolls that had been his constant companions. When the reader finally closed his eyes, the world didn't stop, but it certainly tilted. The man who had organized the known world into categories had stepped into the one category that defies language, the silence of the end. He left behind a legacy that was currently being packed into wooden crates, a treasure of thought that would survive fires, wars, and the collapse of empires. As you drift towards sleep, consider the reassuring order of Aristotle's final acts. He didn't leave a mess. He left a garden. He didn't leave questions. He left a method. He showed us that to be great-souled is not to be a god, but to be a person who takes care of their own, who honors their promises, and who treats the world with a steady, curious kindness. You don't have to be a giant of history tonight. You can simply be a person who has finished their day's work and made their peace with the evening. The will of your own life is written in the small choices you make to be kind, to be balanced, and to be present. The night in Chalcis has finally claimed the horizon. The Euripus Strait continues its restless, rhythmic dance, but inside the house, everything is still. The lamp has burned down to a small, warm glow, and the air smells of old parchment and the sea. You are safe in the middle ground of your own existence. The reader is at rest, his books are safe, and the woman he loved is cared for. There is nothing left to categorize, nothing left to prove. The logic of the day has given way to the poetry of the night. The giants, Plato with his upward finger, and Aristotle with his steady palm, are moving back into the shadows of the olive grove. They have given you their visions, and now they are giving you their silence. The world is a place of deep, logical beauty, and you are a part of that design. Sleep now while the stars follow their mathematical paths, and the earth turns with a slow, Aristotelian certainty. The library is closed, the will is sealed, and the truth is sleeping with you. The physical departure of Aristotle from the world in 322 BC triggered a sequence of events that historians often describe as a slow-motion vanishing act. While Plato's academy remained a landmark in Athens, a beacon of the upward gaze that was easily found by any seeker, the down vision of Aristotle, his technical treatises, his lecture notes, and his biological maps began to slide into the shadows. The great library of the Lyceum was not a public monument. It was a private collection, and it was about to embark on a journey that sounds more like a myth than history. The scrolls were left to his successor, Theophrastus, who in turn left them to a student named Neleus. Neleus took this mountain of papyrus away from the intellectual center of Athens to his home in Shepsis, a small town in Asia Minor. It was here that the Aristotelian soul was literally buried. To prevent the kings of Pergamum from seizing the books for their own library, Neleus's family hid them in a damp, dark cellar. For 2 centuries, while empires rose and fell, the most systematic mind in history was being slowly eaten by worms and softened by mold in the Anatolian dirt. Historians still argue whether this cellar period was a tragedy or a strange form of preservation. Because the technical works were hidden, the world for several generations only knew Aristotle through his popular exoteric writings, dialogues that were said to be as beautiful and poetic as Plato's own. These works, which would have shown us the visionary side of Aristotle, have since been lost to time. What remained in that cellar were the acrobatic works, the dense, jagged, difficult notes intended for his inner circle. When they were finally rediscovered around 100 BC by a collector named Apellicon, they were in a state of ruin. Apellicon tried to restore them, filling in the gaps of the worm-eaten text with his own guesses, creating a version of Aristotle that was part genius and part patchwork. It wasn't until the Roman general Sulla seized the library and brought it to Rome that a true editor, Andronicus of Rhodes, finally organized the chaos into the books we read today. There is a subtle humor in the thought of these world-changing ideas surviving purely because they were too dusty and difficult for anyone to bother stealing. The looking down philosophy was preserved in the dark, much like the seeds Aristotle studied, waiting for the right soil and the right light to grow again. While the library was underground, the Platonic soul was the only voice heard in the Mediterranean, shaping the early mystical traditions and the rising Christian thought. By the time Aristotle's logic and biology were reassembled in Rome, they felt like a message from a lost civilization, a new way of seeing that was actually very old. The Romans, with their love for law and engineering, embraced this recovered Aristotle, finding in his categories a mirror for their own orderly world. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, consider the fragility of human thought. The ideas that shape your world today, the way we classify plants, the way we use logic to win an argument, the way we understand cause and effect, survived by a hair's breadth. They were hidden in the earth, protected by the silence of the cellar. This reminds us that truth does not always need a trumpet or a throne. Sometimes it just needs a safe place to wait. The Aristotelian soul is a survivor. It knows how to endure the damp and the dark, trusting that eventually someone will bring a lamp. The night is its own kind of cellar, a quiet, dark space where the day's work is stored away. You don't have to worry about the worms of anxiety or the mold of regret tonight. Your thoughts, your efforts, and your visions are safe in the library of your own mind. Like the scrolls in Skepsis, they are resting, waiting for the morning when you will unroll them again with fresh eyes. The reader is no longer a man in a grove, but a presence in the very structure of how we think. He is the one who taught us that even when a book is closed, the truth remains written. The air is still, and the light of the world has been tucked away. You are in the Skepsis of your own sleep, a place of hidden potential and deep, quiet preservation. The logic of the day has been archived, and the poetry of the dream is beginning to stir. Trust in the cycle of rediscovery. Trust that what is valuable in you will never truly vanish, even if it stays hidden for a while. Sleep now, while the history of the soul continues to turn its pages in the dark. The cellar is secure, the scrolls are waiting, and the morning is inevitable. While the physical scrolls of the Lyceum lay in the damp silence of a cellar in Asia Minor, the Aristotelian soul began a migration that would lead it far from the borders of Greece and deep into the heart of the rising Islamic world. This was the era of the whispers in the desert, a period where the looking down method found a new and vibrant home in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. While Western Europe was entering a fractured age where much of the Greek language was being forgotten, the scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate were embarking on a massive translation movement. They saw no conflict between the Quran and the categories. To them, reason was a gift from God, a tool to be sharpened. Historians still argue whether the Islamic Golden Age was a preservation of the past or a radical reinvention of it. But one thing is certain. Aristotle was their master. They called him Al-Mu'allim al-Awwal, the first teacher. Imagine a scholar like Al-Farabi or the polymath Avicenna sitting in a courtyard, cooled by fountains and scented with jasmine, unrolling a translation of the metaphysics. They didn't just read Aristotle, they breathed him. They took his looking down gaze and applied it to medicine, astronomy, and optics with a precision that would have made the Stagirite weep with joy. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine became the definitive text for centuries, grounding the healing arts in the Aristotelian observation of the particular. They realized that to understand the Creator, one must understand the creation. The Aristotelian soul was being dressed in robes of silk and ink, moving through the libraries of Cordoba and Cairo, proving that logic has no country and truth requires no passport. There is a gentle, cross-cultural humor in the thought of these medieval scholars trying to reconcile Aristotle's Greek examples with their own lives. When Aristotle spoke of the golden mean, using the metaphor of a Greek wrestler, the desert scholars perhaps thought of the steady, measured pace of a camel caravan. They were taking the skeleton of reason and giving it new flesh. In the 12th century, the philosopher Averroes, the great commentator, wrote so extensively on Aristotle that he became the essential bridge back to Europe. When the looking down philosophy finally returned to the West through the translation schools of Toledo, it didn't come back as a dusty relic of the past. It came back as a living, breathing system of thought, refined by centuries of Middle Eastern genius. As you settle into the quiet of your own night, think about the incredible journey these ideas have taken to reach you. They have traveled across deserts, survived the fall of empires, and crossed the boundaries of language and faith. This reminds us that our own internal library, the things we believe, the values we hold, is often a tapestry woven from threads we didn't create. We are all part of a global conversation that never truly stops. The Aristotelian soul is a traveler, and tonight it is resting with you. The night is a vast, quiet desert, and your thoughts are like a caravan moving toward the oasis of sleep. You don't have to carry the weight of the world's wisdom tonight. You can trust that the first teacher and the great commentator have done the heavy lifting. The logic is sound, the observations are recorded, and the path is clear. Like the scholars in Baghdad, you can find peace in the pursuit of understanding, even if that understanding is simply knowing when to let go of the day. The stars above you are the same stars that Al-Farabi watched from his balcony, following the mathematical paths Aristotle first described. The universe is an ordered, beautiful place, held together by the unmoved mover of curiosity and the final cause of rest. Sleep now, while the whispers of the past continue to echo softly in the halls of history. The library of the desert is quiet, the fountain is still, and the truth is safe in the dark. The return of the first teacher to the Latin West in the 13th century was not a quiet homecoming. It was an intellectual explosion that shook the vaulted ceilings of every cathedral in Europe. After centuries of dwelling in the whispers of the desert, the looking down philosophy arrived in the university halls of Paris and Oxford, translated from Arabic back into a sharp, clinical Latin. This was the Great Reconciliation, a period where the medieval mind struggled to marry the soaring, mystical up of Platonic Christianity with the grounded, empirical down of Aristotelian science. Historians still argue whether this era was a surrender of faith to reason or the moment faith finally found its eyes. At the center of this storm stood Thomas Aquinas, a man who looked at the two visions of the soul and decided that they were not rivals, but a pair of compasses meant to map the same territory. Aquinas, often described as a second Aristotle, realized that the Aristotelian soul, the organizing principle of the body, could be reconciled with the Platonic soul, the eternal spark. He argued that since God created both the world and the mind, a contradiction between faith and reason was a logical impossibility. If Aristotle's biology and physics were true, then they must be a reflection of divine order. This was a revolutionary shift in the Western gaze. It meant that the particulars, the way a bird flies, the way a stone falls, the way a human heart beats, were not distractions from God, but a way to know Him. The laboratory became a sanctuary. The scientist became a kind of priest of the material world. To study the down was to honor the up. There is a soft, academic humor in the way this played out in the university lecture halls. Imagine the shock of a young monk, raised on the poetic allegories of the early church, suddenly being forced to master the syllogism and the four causes. They had to learn that happiness was not just a pious feeling, but a habit of excellence and an activity of the soul. It was as if a group of poets had been suddenly drafted into an engineering firm. But this rigorous training produced the greatest flowering of intellectual clarity in history. It gave birth to the scholastic method, a way of thinking so precise that it built the foundations for the legal systems and the scientific method we use today. The reader had returned to the West, and he brought with him a toolbox that would eventually build the modern world. As you drift toward the quiet center of the night, consider how this great reconciliation lives on in your own life. We all struggle to find the balance between our grace and our nature. We have moments where we seek a higher meaning, the Platonic up, and moments where we must deal with the hard, practical facts of our existence, the Aristotelian down. Thomas Aquinas reminds us that we don't have to choose. We are allowed to be both spiritual and scientific, both dreamers and doers. The two gestures of the soul are the two wings that allow the mind to fly. The night is a place of reconciliation where the divisions of the day begin to blur. Your body, that Aristotelian matter, is resting and repairing itself, following the logical laws of biology. Your mind, that Platonic form, is beginning to wander into the realm of the dream, seeking the universal and the eternal. They are not at war. They are in a state of perfect counterpoint. You are the golden mean of your own existence, a harmony of flesh and spirit, logic and love. The lamps in the medieval scriptorium have been blown out, and the heavy leather-bound volumes are closed. The first teacher and the great reconciliation have done their work. The world is no longer a place of shadows and fear, but a place of light and order. You can trust in the structure of the universe and the integrity of your own soul. Sleep now, while the history of thought rests quietly on the shelf. The cathedral is silent, the stars are mathematical, and the truth is at home with you. The passage of time eventually brought the two visions of the soul to a room in the Vatican, where the paint was still wet and the air smelled of plaster and linseed oil. It is here, between 1509 and 1511, that the high Renaissance painter, Raphael, gave us the visual summary of everything we have discussed. In his masterpiece, The School of Athens, he gathered the greatest minds of antiquity into a single, majestic hall that feels like a cathedral of thought. At the very center of the composition, framed by a series of soaring arches that lead the eye towards the infinite, stand the two giants. Plato, on the left, is an elderly man with the face of Leonardo da Vinci, carrying his book, the Timaeus, his hand pointing resolutely to the sky. Aristotle, on the right, is a man in the prime of his life, carrying his ethics, his hand extended palm down toward the earth. This single image did more to cement the up and down distinction than 1,000 years of dusty scrolls. Historians still argue whether Raphael intended this as a scene of conflict or a scene of perfect collaboration. But the architecture of the room suggests the latter. They are the two pillars holding up the roof of human civilization. If you look closely at the figures surrounding them, you see the Aristotelian soul in action. To the side, Euclid, or perhaps Archimedes, crouches on the floor with a compass, drawing a geometric proof on a slate, while a group of students leans in with intense, focused curiosity. This is the looking down at its most practical. The belief that the secrets of the universe are written in the language of measurement. Nearby, Diogenes the Cynic sprawls on the steps, a man who famously told Alexander the Great to move out of his sunlight, reminding us that the soul's freedom often begins with the rejection of material clutter. The painting is a frozen symposium, a moment where the reader and the visionary coexist in a state of mutual respect. It was a visual promise to the world. We can have both the dream and the data. We can reach for the heavens without losing our footing on the stone. There is a gentle, artistic humor in the fact that Raphael painted himself into the corner of the fresco, looking out at the viewer as if to say, "And where do you stand in this hall?" He understood that the artist's soul is the ultimate bridge. To paint a human face, you must understand the anatomy of the bone and muscle, Aristotle. But you must also capture the light of the spirit that no scalpel can find, Plato. As the Renaissance gave way to the scientific revolution, the Aristotelian soul faced its most brutal test. New voices began to argue that we had become too dependent on the reader's old books and not enough on the dissector's new tools. Francis Bacon argued that Aristotle's logic was a hindrance to discovery because it focused on arguing about words rather than observing things. He wanted a new organon, a tool that would use induction, gathering facts to find a rule rather than deduction. This was Aristotle's own method being turned against his followers. Yet even as they moved away from his specific physics, they were moving closer to his spirit, the belief that truth is found by looking at the world with honest, unblinking eyes. As the night air cools your room, think about how this tension between the old truth and the new sight lives within you. We all have moments where we cling to what we were told, the comfortable shadows of our past, and moments where we must be brave enough to look through the telescope and see the world as it truly is. We are all scientists of our own lives, collecting data, making observations, and trying to find the golden mean between tradition and discovery. The School of Athens is never really closed. The arches of that hall stretch into your own mind. You are the one holding the compass. You are the one looking at the stars. The up gesture of Plato reminds you to hope, to imagine a better version of yourself, to believe in the form of the good. The down gesture of Aristotle reminds you to be present, to count your blessings, to do the work of the day with excellence and habit. Sleep now in the grand cathedral of human thought, where the paint never dries and the conversation never ends. The light of the arches is fading into the soft glow of the moon, and the giants are finally lowering their hands to rest. The long camera of history, which has traveled from the sun-drenched olive groves of Athens to the damp cellars of Shepsis, the desert libraries of Baghdad, and the soaring cathedrals of Paris, now pans slowly back to the present moment, to the quiet of your room and the steady rhythm of your own breath. We find ourselves at the end of the journey, where the two visions of the soul are no longer distant philosophies, but the very fabric of our everyday lives. Historians still argue whether the great divide between Plato and Aristotle was a conflict to be settled or a harmony to be maintained. But as we stand in the twilight of this story, we realize that the answer lies in the balance. We are the unending conversation. We are the heirs to the up and the down, the dreamers who still need to count the stars, and the realists who still need to find a higher meaning in the dirt. Aristotle's legacy, the looking down gaze, has given us the modern world. Every time you benefit from a medical breakthrough, every time you rely on a logical legal system, every time you use a technology that was built on the observation of physical laws, you are standing in the shadow of the Lyceum. He taught us that the world is not a trap or a shadow, but a masterpiece of organization, a place where the particular is the doorway to the universal. He gave us the courage to trust our senses and the tools to categorize the chaos. But the Platonic soul remains our constant companion, the voice that whispers that there is more than just chemistry and physics, that there is a form of justice, a form of beauty, and a form of love that transcends the rotting of the flower and the breaking of the heart. There is a final, gentle humor in the realization that these two ghosts still argue within us every single day. In the morning, you are an Aristotelian. You make your coffee, you check your schedule, you follow your habits, and you deal with the matter of the world. In the evening, as the lights grow dim and the tasks of the day are done, you become a Platonist. You look out the window, You wonder about the why, and you reach for a sense of peace that doesn't depend on your productivity. Most human lives are not a choice between the two. They are a movement between them, a golden mean that we spend our entire lives trying to find. We are the middle ground, where the up and the down finally meet and shake hands. As you prepare for the deepest part of your rest, consider that the two visions of the soul have finished their work for the night. The library of the Lyceum is closed, and the garden of the academy is quiet. The first teacher has laid down his stylus, and the visionary has seen his light. The categories are all in place, the causes are all understood, and the unmoved mover is at rest. You don't have to seek or analyze tonight. You don't have to be a reader or a dissector. You can simply be a soul, existing in the beautiful, logical, and mysterious order of the universe. The story of the soul is a long one, but it is also a very simple one. It is the story of a curious mind, trying to find its way home. Whether home is a place beyond the stars or a place right here on the earth, the journey is the same. The giants are watching over you, one pointing up to remind you of your potential, and one pointing down to remind you of your presence. Together, they create a space of perfect calm, a space where you can finally let go of the questions and embrace the silence. The conversation is over, the ink is dry, and the world is safe. The world is very quiet now. The centuries have folded themselves away like old scrolls, and the voices of the masters have softened into a whisper that is no louder than the wind in the pines. You have walked the long paths of history, from the white marble of Athens to the velvet dark of the present, and you have found that the truth is not a destination, but a peace. Your mind is a library where the lamps have been dimmed, and your heart is a garden where the shadows are long and cool. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to prove. The logic of the universe is holding you, and the beauty of the ideal is watching over you. You are part of the great chain of being, a steady pulse in the heart of a logical and lovely world. Feel the weight of the day lifting, moving from the actual into the potential, from the noise into the silence. The golden mean is here, in this moment of perfect rest. Sleep now, while the stars follow their ancient mathematical paths, and the earth turns with a gentle, certain grace. You are home. You are safe. You are at peace. Sweet dreams.